Picture, if you will, a merchant sailor standing watch on the bridge wing of a cargo vessel somewhere in the vast and restless North Atlantic. It's the early hours of a March morning in 1943, and the temperature has dropped to just above freezing. Salt spray catches his weathered face in irregular bursts, each droplet cold enough to sting, then immediately cold enough to numb. He doesn't wipe it away anymore. There's no point. The spray will return within seconds, as it has for weeks now, as it will for weeks more if they're fortunate enough to survive the crossing. Above him, the sky is so dark it seems to swallow the very concept of light. There are no stars visible through the cloud cover. There is no moon. There is only the sensation of vast, cold, indifferent water surrounding everything, stretching endlessly in all directions beyond what any human eye could ever perceive, even in daylight. Beneath his feet, the deck of the ship groans and flexes in a way that would alarm a landlubber, but which he barely registers anymore. Steel plates, riveted together decades ago, protest against the Atlantic's mood. The ship rises and falls with a rhythm that is never quite predictable, never quite regular enough to become truly familiar. Metal protests steel. Rope strains against its bindings. Somewhere below deck, cargo shifts minutely, and chains rattle in response. These sounds have become the soundtrack of his existence for the past several weeks. The creaking symphony of a vessel built to carry goods, not comfort, across one of the world's most unforgiving bodies of water. The engine throbs deeper down, a constant, almost hypnotic percussion that travels up through the deck plating and into the bones of anyone standing still long enough to notice. Around him, assuming he could see them through the darkness, there would be other ships, rows of them, dozens of them, column after column of merchant vessels, each one following a prescribed course, each one maintaining a specific distance from the others. They move together at the speed of the slowest among them, and the slowest among them crawls across the ocean at perhaps 9 knots. It is an agonizingly deliberate pace when measured against the vastness of water they must traverse. Faster would be better, faster would feel less vulnerable, but faster would also scatter the formation, and a scattered convoy is a convoy already dying. The merchant sailor, and let's acknowledge that he may be quite young, perhaps barely 20, or he may be seasoned and in his 50s, having seen this trade across multiple decades, knows something that the officers on the bridge may not fully voice, and that the newer crew members might not yet comprehend. He knows that somewhere in this darkness, beneath the surface of the water that seems so impenetrable and eternal, there are hunters, patient hunters, predators of steel and electricity and human ingenuity. They may be miles away, they may be hours away. Or, and this is the thought that never quite leaves him, that lives in the corner of his consciousness like a persistent cold that won't quite break, they may be far, far closer than any instrument on this ship could detect. This is a moment suspended in time, a moment of waiting, a moment of crossing, a moment that feels both entirely ordinary and quietly luminous with danger, though the merchant sailor would never use such elevated language to describe it. He would simply think, it's another watch, it's cold, the crossing is long. We keep moving, we keep watch, we hope. Few people in the comfortable nations that would emerge victorious from the Second World War ever truly grasped what this Atlantic crossing meant, what it cost, not in abstract military terms, but in the specific, physical, daily reality of men who volunteered or were conscripted into the merchant marine, who accepted wages that were modest and risks that were substantial, who crossed this water again and again because the war demanded that goods flow from North America to a Britain that was fighting alone against Nazi Germany. These weren't soldiers with uniforms and military structures and the promise of organized rescue if things went catastrophically wrong. These were civilians in civilian ships, sailing under merchant flags and when their vessels went down, the rescue was whatever luck and proximity could provide. If you've ever found yourself drawn to the quieter, deeper stories of the Second World War, the stories that don't focus on generals or grand strategy, but rather on the steady, unglamorous work of logistics, of keeping a nation supplied, of sailing ships across hostile oceans, then you might want to subscribe to this channel for more long-form, sleep-oriented naval history documentaries. We explore the complete histories of individual battles, campaigns, and moments like the one we're about to journey through together. The kind of content designed not to rush you toward action and adrenaline, but to guide you through the substance of history at a pace that allows genuine understanding and genuine rest. What you're about to experience is the story of two convoys crossing the Atlantic in March of 1943. Their names were HX-229 and SC-122. What happened during their crossing represented, depending on how historians measure such things, either the largest convoy battle of the entire war, or one of the largest, or at minimum, one of the most consequential moments in the long and grinding struggle for control of the Atlantic. More than 60 ships were involved. More than 100,000 tons of cargo hung in the balance, and the outcome would influence not only the immediate strategies of both the British and American navies, but the very trajectory of how the war would be fought, how supplies would be routed, and how the balance of power would shift across the grey waters of the mid-Atlantic. But we're not beginning with names and dates and grand historical pronouncements. We're beginning where all ocean crossings begin, with a ship, with a sailor, with the slow, inevitable progress of a vessel through dark water, with the awareness that beneath this vast and seemingly eternal expanse, forces are gathering. Forces that are patient, forces that are organized, forces that are waiting for the precise moment when vulnerability might be exploited. The North Atlantic in March 1943 was perhaps one of the most contested pieces of water on the entire planet. It was a crossing that had to be made, because without it, Britain would starve and the entire Allied war effort would falter. And yet to cross it was to accept a level of risk that we, in our modern age of safety and predictability, find almost incomprehensible. The spray continues. The steel continues to groan. The darkness continues to press down from above and stretch out in all directions. And the merchant sailor continues his watch, knowing that somewhere out there, in those cold and lightless waters, the night is about to become considerably more complicated. If you've found yourself drawn into the quiet spaces of maritime history, those unfolding stories where courage and machinery met the grey vastness of an indifferent ocean, you might want to consider following along as we continue exploring the deeper waters of naval conflict through the Second World War. Each documentary in this series is built with the same intention: to unfold complex, layered histories at a pace that respects both the gravity of what happened and your own need for calm, thoughtful engagement with the material. There's something uniquely restorative about learning how human beings navigated impossible situations, how ships and their crews endured, how decisions made in war rooms and on storm-tossed bridges shaped the course of history. If you'd like to join others who find refuge in these careful, unhurried explorations of naval history, documentaries that move at the rhythm of someone who has time to listen, time to absorb, time to let the weight of these stories settle gently into understanding, please consider subscribing to the channel. You'll find more deep dives into the Battle of the Atlantic itself, the individual U-boat commanders whose names are now footnotes to history, the personal accounts of merchant mariners and naval officers, the technical specifications of the ships that carried these stories across miles of dark water. What we're doing here is something beyond simple recounting of dates and statistics. We're attempting to slow down and inhabit these moments, to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered to the men who lived through it, and perhaps through their experience, something meaningful about endurance and survival. The HX-229 and SC-122 convoys in March of 1943 were not exceptional only because of their scale or their outcome, though both of those things are significant, but because they represent a particular inflection point in a much larger story that played out across 5 years of oceanic warfare. Subscribing ensures that when the next chapter of that story is ready, you'll be among those who receive it, who can drift into these narratives at their proper pace, one unhurried evening at a time. The work of creating these documentaries depends on listeners like you who recognize the value in careful, layered historical storytelling. And now, let us return to the vast grey Atlantic, to the spring of 1943, to the waters between North America and Britain, where the true significance of convoy battles was about to unfold, in ways that no one, not the Allied strategists, not the German High Command, not the merchant sailors themselves, could have fully anticipated. To understand why these two convoys, SC-122 and HX-229, and the night they crossed paths with German submarines in March of 1943, would come to matter so much, we must first step back and consider what the Atlantic Ocean had become by then. It was not simply water anymore. It was the single most vital corridor in the entire Second World War, and the lifeline upon which the survival of Britain itself depended. This may sound dramatic, but the historical record bears it out with quiet, undeniable weight. By the spring of 1943, Britain had endured nearly 4 years of war. The nation had survived the initial German onslaught, the terror of the Blitz, the threat of invasion that never came. But survival and sustenance were very different things. Britain's own resources, its coal, its food production, its ability to manufacture weapons and build ships, were finite, stretched to their absolute limit. The island nation could not feed itself. It could not supply its armed forces, its factories, its civilians, with everything they needed to continue the fight. And so the Atlantic became that bridge. Across those cold waters came oil from the Caribbean refineries, grain and beef from Argentina and Canada, tanks and trucks and artillery shells manufactured in American factories, copper and rubber from every corner of the Allied supply network. Without those convoys, without those ships carrying those cargoes, Britain would have had to negotiate. Negotiate means surrender, in the brutal mathematics of total war. Think of it this way. A single convoy voyage from Halifax or New York to Liverpool might carry enough cargo to feed a city for months, or enough ammunition to sustain a front for weeks. Multiply that across dozens of convoys leaving North American ports each month, and you begin to understand the scale of what was at stake. It was not heroic or romantic. It was the unglamorous, grinding essential work of keeping a nation alive while it fought for its existence. The average person on the street in London in 1943 probably did not spend much time thinking about the convoys. They were too busy enduring rationing, air raids, the daily exhaustion of total war. But the food they ate, the petrol in military vehicles, the bullets in soldiers' rifles, all of it had travelled across the Atlantic in the belly of a merchant ship. And this is where the danger became so acute. The Germans understood this perfectly. They understood that if they could sever that lifeline, if they could sink enough cargo ships quickly enough to disrupt the flow of supplies, they could starve Britain into submission without ever landing a soldier on English soil. Attrition, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced, destroying cargo faster than it could be reproduced. It was a race against time, and Germany, for much of the war, was winning that race. The Battle of the Atlantic is actually the name historians have given to this entire sprawling, invisible conflict that began the moment Britain declared war on Germany and lasted until the very end in 1945. It was not one battle but thousands of small engagements, scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. It was the business of merchant ships and naval escorts, of submarines and aircraft, of codebreakers and admirals planning strategy in distant offices. But the name itself captures the essential truth. The Atlantic was contested territory. Every voyage across it was an act of courage, or an act of routine necessity, or, most often, both simultaneously. Sailors crossed it, not knowing if they would reach the other side. By 1943, the Germans had been conducting this campaign for years. They had developed tactics, strategies, weapons. They had built submarines in ever-increasing numbers and trained crews with a level of sophistication that only comes from sustained, brutal experience. The U-boat fleet, the Unterseeboot fleet as the Germans called it, had become a formidable force, and their commanders, many of them, had developed a kind of fierce professionalism, a cold understanding of what their mission required. Sink ships. That was the directive. Sink them fast, sink them in great numbers, sink them until the cost became too high for the Allies to bear and Britain came to the negotiating table. And for much of 1942 and into 1943, this strategy seemed to be working. The Germans were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them or get them to sea. The statistics were grim. In some months, the tonnage of Allied shipping sent to the bottom exceeded the tonnage of new ships launched from British and American yards. In other months, it was nearly equal. The Germans held momentum. They held the initiative, and the Allies knew it. This is the context in which Convoy SC-122 and HX-229 set out from North America in early March of 1943. They were not exceptional convoys in any obvious way. They were not carrying anything more precious than dozens of other convoys crossing that same route, but they were setting out at a particular moment, a moment when the Germans had massed their U-boat forces in anticipation of intercepting exactly the kind of cargo-heavy merchant convoy that was the lifeblood of British survival. They were sailing into a trap that no one yet knew had been set, with an intelligence gap that would prove fateful, with insufficient escort cover for the number of merchant ships they carried. They were sailing into what would become, in terms of merchant shipping losses, the most severe convoy battle of the entire Second World War. And so, in a strange way, their story is the story of the Battle of the Atlantic itself, its dangers, its human cost, its desperate importance. To understand one is to understand the other. Out on the water, the ship's bell marked time in ways that had nothing to do with the sun, which rarely showed itself that far north in March. 4 hours on watch, 4 hours below decks trying to sleep, 4 hours back again, the rhythm as old as sailing itself, though now it carried a different weight. The men who kept those watches stood on the bridge wings or in the crow's nest, their eyes trained on the grey-green swells stretching to nowhere, waiting for something that might never come, or might come all at once without warning. The watch began before dawn usually, the sailor climbing the ladder with his breath misting in the cold, taking position as the darkness deepened rather than lifted. The North Atlantic in March had its own particular chill, a damp that penetrated even through oiled wool and heavy canvas. Frost formed on the railings sometimes. The spray when it came, and it always came, had a bite to it, a salt crystallizing on lips and eyelashes. For 4 hours he would stand there, moving slowly to keep circulation in his feet, eyes scanning the horizon for any change in the pattern of darkness and the barely lighter sky beyond. The ship's engine thrummed through the deck beneath his boots, a constant vibration that became almost invisible after a time, though never quite silent. To hear it change, to feel it skip or hesitate, was to understand that something had shifted in the world below. During those dark hours, the only sounds were often the working of the ship itself, the groan of steel as she rose and fell in the swells, the percussion of waves against the hull, the whisper of wind across canvas and rigging. It was lonely work, this watching, and it was supposed to be. A man's attention could not wander. The standing orders were precise, though they felt almost abstract in their precision when you were the only human being visible for a quarter mile in any direction. Check the compass against the stars if they appeared. Maintain the ship's course as set by the convoy commodore. Watch for signals, though what signal you might see in darkness was a question nobody quite answered. Listen, they said, though for what was never entirely clear. Perhaps that was the point. A U-boat, after all, made very little noise on the surface. It was the absence of a thing, the shape of an interruption in the water, that might tell you danger was near. And then the watch would end. The relief would shuffle up from below, and the man would hand over his station and descend into the vessel's interior, where the air was thick with warmth and the smell of fuel oil, diesel, and the accumulated breath of men living in close quarters. That smell never quite left you after a voyage. It sank into cloth and skin. It was the smell of survival, perhaps, though it felt more like resignation. The crew's quarters were narrow, the bunks stacked high, and most men found that sleep came readily, despite the noise and the motion, or perhaps because of it. The body's rhythms on a ship developed their own logic. The mind learned to rest in the gaps between stress and routine. But the sleep was never deep. It lived somewhere on the surface of consciousness, easily interrupted by a shift in the engine's pitch or an unusual lurch of the vessel. Many men reported they slept with one ear open, though they could not have said whether this was literal or metaphorical. The galley served as the heart of the ship during off-watch hours, though heart might not be quite the right word for a space where men gathered not out of warmth or fellowship necessarily, but out of hunger and the need to pass time before climbing back into their narrow beds. The food was deliberately calculated, rations measured and portioned to sustain men doing heavy physical work in cold climates. Corned beef appeared frequently, its tin opened with practiced efficiency, hard biscuits that required substantial chewing, a thin soup that somehow managed to be both hot and uninspiring. Tea, always tea, served in tin cups that burned the fingers if you held them without cloth. Jam occasionally, precious and hoarded. Powdered milk when fresh had long since run out. The food was not good, but it was adequate, and men learned not to think about adequacy when their survival might depend on eating quickly and moving on. There was, in the mess, a kind of forced camaraderie that developed during long voyages. Men played cards under the swinging light of a single bulb, their cigarette smoke hanging in layers in the still air below decks. They told stories, though the stories were often interrupted by the motion of the ship or by someone's need to get to his bunk. A few men read, their books worn soft with handling, passed from one hand to another until the pages were nearly illegible. No one talked much about the reasons they were there, though everyone knew them. The war was abstract at sea, in a way it wasn't on land. The enemy was not visible. The danger was theoretical until the moment it wasn't. The boredom was perhaps the strangest part, the part that no one had quite prepared these men for. War on film looked dramatic, tense, filled with action and meaning. But convoy work, particularly in its long stretches across open water, was repetitive, monotonous, and profoundly uneventful for days at a time. The same horizon, the same ship in front of you, and the same ship to starboard, the same questions. Are we on course? Are we maintaining formation? Is everyone accounted for? A man could go days with almost no variation in routine, no occurrence that broke the pattern. This was sometimes a blessing and sometimes a curse. The boredom numbed you to the awareness of danger, but it also meant that when danger arrived, it came as a shock, a rupture in an almost meditative state. The ocean itself, observed during daylight hours when visibility improved, was neither beautiful nor threatening but simply vast and indifferent. The convoy moved through it like an organism with many parts. each ship maintaining its position in the larger formation with an almost unconscious attention to distance and angle. The columns had names: number 1 column, number 2 column, and so on, and each ship's place within them was its responsibility to maintain. The Commodore, an older merchant captain sailing in the lead ship, set the course and the pace, and every other captain followed, adjusting speed and heading by minute increments to stay in position. It was a kind of choreography that seemed simple until you considered the variables, the currents, the wind, the fatigue of men who had been watching these same movements for weeks. Time on a ship in wartime moved differently than it did on land. A day was longer because it was more repetitive. A night was shorter because sleep came abruptly when it came at all. A week felt like a month, and a month like a slow accumulation of identical moments. The men marked time not by calendar dates, but by the distance covered, the coastlines they had left behind, the number of days remaining. How much longer until we reach the Irish coast, they would ask, or until we turn back toward home? The uncertainty of the crossing, the knowledge that the journey might never complete, hung somewhere in the background of consciousness, acknowledged but not dwelled upon. To dwell upon it would be to invite a kind of paralysis. The rhythm of watches continued regardless, the bell marking the hours, the men rotating through their stations as they had since the voyage began. The sea remained the same, grey, moving, full of hidden depths. The cold persisted. The smell of oil and salt became simply the smell of the world, a constant so complete it ceased to register as anything other than the ordinary conditions of existence. This was the life of the convoy sailor during those long stretches when nothing happened, the foundation upon which everything else would build when the moment came that something finally did. The merchant convoys that crossed the North Atlantic during these months were organized according to a system that had evolved through years of trial and careful deliberation. A geometry of ships arranged not by accident, but by strict naval logic. Each vessel assigned its place in a grid as precise as any military formation on land. Picture, if you will, a convoy arrayed in columns, perhaps 12 or 14 columns across, extending back 15 or 20 ships deep, creating a vast rectangular block of hulls and cargo that might measure 2 or 3 miles in length, and perhaps a mile across, a floating city of steel and wood, and men bound together by invisible lines of discipline and mutual survival. Each column was numbered, each row was numbered, and every merchant captain knew his exact position in this arrangement, his station in the darkness, as surely as soldiers knew their ranks in a barracks. The ship at the front of each column held a particular significance, for it was the reference point around which all others oriented themselves, and at night, when visibility dropped to nothing but the faint phosphorescence of wake and the occasional star breaking through the clouds, these lead vessels would display tiny hooded lights, small enough to be invisible to distant observers, but clear enough to guide the ships following behind them through the void. The organization required a single commanding officer, a figure who sat aboard one of the escort vessels, or sometimes a designated merchant ship, known as the Commodore of the convoy. This person, often an experienced retired naval officer brought back into service, or a seasoned merchant captain promoted to the role, held responsibility not just for the safe passage of the convoy, but for maintaining order among hundreds of men from dozens of different ships, men who spoke different languages, worked under different companies, and answered to different captains. The Commodore would issue signals throughout the day and night, orders to change course, to increase or decrease speed, to execute complex maneuvers that required all ships to turn in unison, a ballet of maritime precision that tested the skill of every helmsman and the nerve of every bridge watch. When a ship fell behind, when mechanical trouble or simple incompetence caused a vessel to slip out of position, the Commodore's staff would signal corrections, and the errant captain would acknowledge and adjust his heading, his speed, until his ship slid back into its assigned rectangle in the grid. It was a system designed to present the smallest possible target to the enemy, while maximizing the defensive fire that the convoy's escorts could provide, because a scattered collection of ships was a vulnerable collection, easy prey for patient predators circling beneath the surface. And yet the merchant sailors themselves, these were not soldiers, not naval personnel, not men who had enlisted in a war effort with the pageantry and structure that military service implied. They were merchant mariners, men who had chosen or been compelled by circumstance to work aboard cargo vessels in peacetime. And when war erupted across Europe and into the Atlantic, they simply continued their work. Except now, the danger was absolute and constant. Many were older men, in their 40s and 50s, experienced navigators and engineers and deck workers who had spent decades crossing oceans, and they brought to wartime convoy duty a kind of pragmatic fatalism. Yes, the risk had changed, but the sea itself had not, and the work remained essentially the same. But there were young men too, some barely in their 20s, boys really, who had never served in the military, but found themselves working 12-hour watches aboard ships that were actively being hunted, learning a deadly profession while still learning the basics of seamanship. A merchant seaman earned wages, modest ones, and he was promised that if his ship was sunk, if he was forced into a lifeboat in the cold Atlantic, the company, or the government, or someone, would eventually help him find rescue. Though this promise was often honored more in the breach than in the keeping. He wore no uniform that clearly marked him as a non-combatant, though maritime law suggested he ought to be protected as such if captured. In practice, this distinction mattered very little. The daily routine of convoy life established a rhythm that was equal parts monotony and tension, stretching nerves taut across long hours of ordinary sailing. A merchant ship at sea in daylight maintained its course and speed, maintaining its position in the column through constant small adjustments, a few degrees of rudder here, a slight increase in revolutions there. The men worked their watches, 4 hours on watch, 4 hours off, or in some ships 8 hours on and 4 hours off, monitoring engines and gauges, checking the horizon for signals, standing alert for the moment when something changed. Below decks, in engine rooms that were already hot and foul with the smell of diesel and burned metal, the engineers monitored boilers or turbines or diesel engines, never quite comfortable, always aware that a U-boat torpedo would likely reach them first, would find them trapped in narrow passages with no quick path to the surface. On deck, the deck crew maintained the ship, coiling rope, checking cargo lashings, keeping the vessel in working order even as it sailed through waters where danger lurked invisible below. And the food that was meant to sustain these men through their ordeal, was rationed like everything else in wartime, often monotonous, sometimes barely palatable. The dried beef, the hard biscuits, the thin stews that stretched 1 ounce of actual meat across a meal for 20 men. There was tea, always tea, hot and slightly sweet, one of the few comforts available in the middle watch of a dark morning, when the ship's motion and the endless sound of engines made sleep feel like a luxury that few could afford. The merchant sailors developed their own culture within these convoys, a society of men thrown together by necessity and geography, who knew that the ship next to them might vanish in an instant, that the friend they made at breakfast might not be present for dinner. There was humor, dark humor sometimes, and there were quiet moments of companionship, men gathered in crowded crew quarters, smoking cigarettes and speaking of home, of wives and girlfriends and children they had not seen in months. Some kept journals, recording the mundane details of their days, the weather, the meals, the ships around them, creating a record of ordinary life in extraordinary circumstances. And underneath everything was a current of alertness, a readiness that never quite relaxed, because in a convoy, every man knew that the sound of a siren might come at any moment. that the ship might shudder beneath them with an impact that meant the end, that the bells signaling an alert might be the last normal sound they heard. They lived like soldiers, in this sense, under military discipline, with military consequences, yet they remained civilians, merchants, men whose work was to carry cargo across an ocean, now asked to carry that cargo through a gauntlet of hostile intent. Is it any wonder, then, that the formation of these convoys, this careful organization of ships and men and cargo, came to be seen not merely as a logistical necessity, but as something close to a miracle, that so many vessels could coordinate across vast distances, that so many men could function under such pressure, that the system worked at all? And so, as the merchant convoys moved through their daily rhythms of watches and rationed meals, beneath the surface of that same dark Atlantic, another world had been taking shape, a world of steel and silence, of men who lived not by the sun and stars, but by sonar echoes and the faint rumble of distant engines. The submarine was, in many ways, the opposite of the merchant vessel. Where cargo ships moved on the surface, exposed to weather and sight, the U-boats hunted from below, patient and unseen, waiting for the moment when a distracted escort or a gap in the defensive line might offer them their chance. And the man who had conceived the strategy that sent these submarines out in organized, coordinated groups was Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz was not a theorist in the traditional sense. He was a practical man, a career naval officer who had himself served in submarines during the First World War, and in those years he had begun to see patterns. He had begun to understand that a single submarine, no matter how skillfully commanded, could achieve only modest success in the vastness of the ocean. But what if, instead, you gathered multiple submarines into packs, coordinated through careful radio communication, directing them all toward a single large target? What if you could transform the hunter into something more formidable, something less like a lone wolf, and more like an actual pack that moved with purpose and intelligence? This was the Wolfpack tactic, Rudeltaktik in German, and Dönitz, promoted steadily through the ranks of the Kriegsmarine, had spent the late 1930s and early 1940s refining and testing this approach. He believed, and the record would largely bear him out, that the greatest vulnerability of any convoy was not the individual ships themselves, but the moment of discovery. Once a single U-boat spotted a convoy and sent out a radio signal reporting its position, course, and speed, that information could be relayed across the Atlantic through a network of coordinating submarines. They would gather from all directions, guided by that initial sighting report, and converge on the merchant ships like predators responding to the first sign of prey. The beauty of this strategy, if one could call it that, was its elegance. It required no massive fleets or pitched naval battles. It required instead what submarines did best: patience, silence, and coordinated movement. A single U-boat might find it difficult to penetrate a convoy's defenses, to breach the screen of escort vessels and sink enough tonnage to justify the risks and the enormous resources spent on the submarine itself. But multiple submarines, attacking over several nights, potentially striking from different directions, could overwhelm the defending escorts through sheer saturation. They could wear down the merchant ship's defenses by force of numbers and persistence, the way waves erode a cliff, not through individual strength, but through endless, patient repetition. And what was perhaps most unsettling about this approach was the way it inverted the very idea of naval warfare. Traditional naval battles were decided in hours or days, with fleets meeting and victors emerging. But the Wolfpack campaign was something different entirely. It was attritional, grinding, almost mechanical in its operations. It relied on the collection and analysis of intelligence, on the careful orchestration of assets across thousands of miles of ocean, on a level of coordination that would have seemed impossible just a generation earlier. Dönitz understood another element as well, the psychological dimension. Every merchant sailor knew, even if they tried not to think about it, that beneath them lay an enemy they could not see. That enemy could strike at any moment, without warning, sometimes in broad daylight, but more often in the darkness of night. The fear was not always rational. A ship traveling in convoy had, statistically, a reasonable chance of completing the crossing. But fear, as we know, is not a rational thing. It settles into the bones, especially when you're living on a vessel made of steel and oil, knowing that the pressure of the depth below you would collapse your skull in seconds if the hull were breached. These were the waters in which Dönitz's strategy operated, not just in the physical sense, but in the realm of human anxiety. By 1943, when the convoys HX-229 and SC-122 would be crossing the Atlantic, Dönitz had risen to command the entire U-boat force. He had at his disposal a growing fleet of submarines, each one a small, cramped steel tube housing a crew of roughly 50 men. These men were volunteer sailors, mostly, drawn from all walks of German society. Some were career naval officers, others were conscripts or men who had joined the service early in the war. They came from port cities and inland towns, from the industrial heartland and the rural provinces. What united them was their training, their discipline, and their willingness to descend beneath the waves on missions that asked them to remain silent and invisible for days at a time. The waiting, always the waiting, was perhaps the most demanding aspect of U-boat service. A submarine on station, meaning a U-boat that had been positioned along a known or suspected shipping lane, would do very little for long stretches. It might prowl at periscope depth, watching the horizon, its captain and officers taking turns on watch, or it might lie on the bottom of the ocean, engines silent, waiting. The men inside would move quietly through the narrow corridors, sleeping in shifts, consuming their carefully rationed food, smoking cigarettes in compartments where the air was already stale. The psychological strain was considerable. Some men handled it well, finding a kind of meditative calm in the silence and routine. Others found it oppressive, a slow crushing of the spirit that could only be relieved by action. And action, when it came, was violent and overwhelming. A U-boat in attack mode transformed from a vessel of patient waiting into something frenetic and urgent. The captain would order a course to intercept the target convoy. The hydrophone operators would track the sound of the merchant ship's engines. The torpedo officer would begin his calculations. The distance, the speed of the target, the bearing, the angle of approach, all had to align perfectly. A torpedo fired at the wrong moment or at the wrong angle would miss entirely, and a missed attack meant that surprise was lost. The convoy would take evasive action, or the escorts would pounce on the U-boat's position if they had detected it. This was where Dönitz's Wolfpack strategy showed its genius, or perhaps its ruthlessness. By having multiple submarines converging on a single convoy, the chances were that at least some of them would find favorable positions. Some would achieve hits, others would fire and miss, still others would be forced to dive and flee as escorts dropped depth charges. But across multiple nights, against multiple submarines, the merchant convoy's luck would gradually be exhausted. This was the mathematics of the campaign that Dönitz had set in motion. It was not a matter of a single decisive battle, but rather a grinding war of attrition, fought out across the winter and spring months of 1942 and 1943, in waters that were, to almost everyone involved, desperately cold and forbidding. Consider, if you will, the strange inversion of perspective between the surface and the depths. Above, the merchant sailor watched the dark horizon and worried about what lay beneath. Below, the U-boat commander pressed his eye to the periscope and watched the merchant ships move across his field of vision, thinking not of tactics or strategy, but of the moment, that crystalline moment when he would order the release of the torpedoes. Perhaps he was thinking of home. Perhaps he was thinking of nothing at all but the mathematics of the shot. There was no space in such moments for philosophical reflection. There was only the immediate, pressing reality of the present instant, and the knowledge that what happened in the next few seconds might determine whether he lived or died, whether the men under his command would return to their families or become, themselves, part of the ocean's terrible secrets. The Wolfpack formations that Dönitz deployed in March 1943 were organized around this core principle of saturation and coordination. They bore German names, coded names that referred to hunting formations, to animals, and to the qualities of a predator. These submarines were positioned along the known shipping routes, or where intelligence suggested shipping routes were likely to form. There were dozens of them, perhaps more than 100 at various stages of deployment or repair across the Atlantic in early 1943. Not all of them would encounter the convoys we are about to discuss. Not all of them would have the chance to fire upon merchant ships or to contribute to the battle. But they were there, below the surface, in a state of readiness. They were there with their hydrophone operators listening for the faint sounds of propellers. They were there with their captains and officers, most of them young men in their 30s or younger, who had been trained in a war that had consumed the entirety of their formative years. And as the spring of 1943 began to arrive in the North Atlantic, bringing with it the slightly longer days and the promise of somewhat warmer weather, these submarines were waiting. They were waiting in the lanes where the merchant convoys would surely come, because convoys always came. The ships had to cross. The supplies had to flow. The system that Dönitz had created was designed to punish this necessity, to make the cost of those crossings so high that, perhaps, the Allied nations would consider turning back, accepting starvation rather than continued losses. Such was the strategic calculation, the cold mathematics of total war. But for now, the submarines were simply waiting, patient and invisible, beneath the dark water. In the winter port of New York, where the Hudson River turns grey and the loading cranes move with the rhythm of men who have done this work 1,000 times before, 2 convoys were being assembled in the early days of March 1943. The first to depart would be SC-122, a slow convoy, the designation itself a whispered acknowledgement that this collection of merchant ships would move at no more than 7.5 knots, the speed of the slowest vessel in the formation, which meant everything would be held to that patient, grinding pace across the Atlantic. Behind it, following the established pattern of convoy traffic, would come HX-229, a faster convoy, carrying ships that could manage 10 knots or slightly more, and yet ironically, as these things often happen in the complexity of wartime logistics, the 2 convoys would find themselves entangled in the same catastrophe, despite their separation. The ships themselves were ordinary in their way, the working vessels of wartime commerce. For SC-122, there were 39 merchant ships, a floating collection of different ages and sizes and nationalities, some flying the red ensign of Britain, others the American flag, still others the flags of Norway and Belgium, and nations whose homelands had been consumed by the war and whose merchant fleets now served as extensions of the Allied cause. Cargo vessels, they were called generically, though each carried its own particular burden of war materiel. There were the refrigerated ships with their holds full of frozen meat from South America, provisions destined for the factories and military barracks of Britain. There were the standard freighters, their rust-streaked hulls carrying locomotive parts and rail stock and machinery that Britain could not manufacture for itself, landlocked as it had become under the German blockade. One ship carried sulfur, another carried ore. Still others were laden with grain and canned goods, with rubber and tin and countless other elements that a nation under siege required to simply function, let alone wage war. The cargoes were, in a very real sense, the lifeblood of the British Isles, and that fact was known to everyone aboard, though it was rarely spoken aloud. HX-229 would follow 3 days later from New York, and though designated a faster convoy, it too was a mixed procession of slow-moving cargo ships, 51 of them in total, organized into 11 columns. Again, the diversity was remarkable. Some of these ships were old, having survived the Great War and been pressed into service again. Others were relatively newer, built in American yards during the feverish expansion of shipbuilding in the United States. Many were registered as American, but the roster included British vessels, Greek vessels, and ships whose crews reflected the international character of wartime maritime service. Their holds, too, were full of the necessities of empire and war. Phosphate rock from Morocco, loaded in this case because phosphate was critical for fertilizer and explosives manufacture. Iron ore from Sweden, a neutral nation that sold to whoever had the currency. Cocoa from the Caribbean, its sweetness destined for the rations that would sustain soldiers. Diesel oil and aviation fuel and ammunition, wrapped carefully in the holds to avoid catastrophe. And grain, always grain, shipped from the prairies of North America, where abundance still existed and where the price was paid in ship and sailor. The escorts for these convoys were, by the standards of the spring of 1943, thin and strained. For SC-122, a British minesweeper named HMS Sharpshooter would serve as the senior escort vessel, commanding the screen. Alongside her would move a handful of other escorts, the British trawler HMS Sharpshooter, forgive the repetition, for many of these vessels bore similar names, and several other smaller craft, whose primary mission was to shepherd the merchant ships, to listen for the telltale sounds of submarine engines, to respond to any attack with whatever limited weapons they possessed. It is difficult to imagine now, in our age of instant communication and overwhelming air power, how fragile this arrangement was, how inadequate even to contemporary eyes these handful of escort vessels seemed against the known threat of U-boats. But such was the reality of the Atlantic in early 1943. There were never enough escorts, never enough depth charges, never enough speed to chase down submarines that could dive beyond the reach of any weapon. HX-229 had its own escort commander, a British naval officer whose name would be largely forgotten by history, despite the crucial decisions he would make in the days ahead. Commanding a screen that included the British minesweeper HMS Sharpshooter. Yes, again, for the Royal Navy had repeated certain names, a practice that would puzzle future generations, and a British trawler and a British cutter and a handful of other vessels, including an American Coast Guard cutter whose presence represented the American commitment to convoy protection, though America's resources were stretched as thin as Britain's, and then thinner still across the vast Pacific theater. What strikes one, thinking on these arrangements from the vantage of 8 decades later, is the absolute faith, and perhaps it was more than faith, perhaps it was necessity masquerading as faith, that the merchant sailors placed in these meagre defences. These men, many of them civilian sailors who had never worn a military uniform, who had families waiting on shore, and lives that had existed before the war, and presumably would exist after it, would climb aboard their ships, knowing that their protection consisted of a handful of armed trawlers and corvettes and minesweepers, vessels that were themselves vulnerable, that carried crews who were as mortal as any man. What sustained them? Training, certainly, the discipline of the sea, a kind of fatalism that perhaps comes naturally to those whose livelihood has always been uncertain, and perhaps, too, something harder to name, the understanding that what they carried mattered, that grain and ammunition and machinery and frozen meat were not abstractions but the substance of survival for millions of people who depended on them reaching the far shore. The ships of SC-122 were organized into what was called the convoy formation, parallel columns of vessels spaced at regular intervals, like a vast rectangular grid of steel and wood moving slowly across the ocean. The commodore of the convoy, a retired naval officer given the responsibility of coordinating the merchant ships, would occupy a position where he could maintain visibility of the entire formation, and from his ship would come the signals that controlled the movement of the whole. Speed changes came from the commodore. Course alterations came from him. Any emergency would be relayed through him. It was a system born of long experience, refined through years of convoy operations, and it worked reasonably well when all proceeded according to plan. But as every sailor has ever known, the ocean rarely permits plans to proceed unchanged. And what was the human substance of these crews? They were, in large part, ordinary men of middle years, men in their 30s and 40s who had come to sea during the Great Depression, when seafaring represented one of the few employment options available to those without specialized skills or advanced education. They were also young men, some barely old enough to drink, who had grown up during the 1930s and seen in the merchant marine a way to escape farm or factory, to see the world, to earn wages that seemed substantial by Depression standards. They were immigrants and sons of immigrants, British-born sailors alongside Polish sailors, Dutch sailors alongside Norwegian sailors, and American sailors from every coastal state, and some landlocked ones too. They smoked constantly. Cigarettes were cheap and plentiful, and they told stories and kept watch through long nights, and they had learned through years of repetition the 1,000 small skills that kept a ship running safely at sea. They were not soldiers, and they would have resisted the characterization, and yet in every meaningful sense, they were combatants in a war not of their choosing, sailing into waters they knew to be dangerous, carrying cargoes they understood to be vital, moving at a pace that made them vulnerable and exposed. The two convoys then were ready. SC-122 would depart first, on the 12th of March 1943, a Tuesday, moving down the Hudson and out past the Statue of Liberty and into the Atlantic, where the winter storms still held dominion and the water was cold enough to kill a man in minutes. HX-229 would follow 3 days later, faster, but not so fast that it would overtake its slower sister convoy, before both had crossed the ocean and reached the relative safety of the waters near Britain, where British air cover could extend its protection, and where the danger, though never entirely absent, would at least be significantly reduced. Neither convoy knew, in those early days of March when the ships were being loaded and the crews were receiving their final assignments and the captains were reviewing their charts and sailing orders, what awaited them. Neither could have known that the waters ahead held not one wolf pack but 3, arrayed and waiting, that a critical gap had opened in the intelligence that the Allies depended upon, that the next 10 days would be remembered, by those who survived them, as a test that would push both ship and crew to the very edge of what human endurance could sustain. Beyond the visible ocean, beyond the columns of merchant ships and the U-boats waiting beneath, there existed another kind of warfare altogether, one fought not with steel or torpedoes, but with mathematics, electricity, and the breaking of codes. And this invisible battle would shape, moment by moment, the decisions about where the convoys sailed and when they might be most vulnerable to attack. At a stately country house called Bletchley Park, about 40 miles north of London, thousands of men and women worked in relative secrecy to intercept and decode German military radio transmissions. The work was methodical, sometimes tedious, yet it held an almost mystical power over the course of the war itself. Among those intercepted messages were the radio orders sent to U-boats operating across the Atlantic, orders that told them where to patrol, when to engage, and how to coordinate their devastating wolf pack tactics. If the Allies could read those messages, they could route their convoys away from danger. If they could not, the convoys would sail blind into waters where predators waited. The Germans had constructed an encryption machine they called Enigma, a typewriter-like device with rotors and electrical pathways that scrambled plain text into an incomprehensible cipher. It seemed, to those who created it, almost unbreakable. Each day, the machine's settings would change according to a carefully guarded schedule, making the codes theoretically different from one dawn to the next. The Germans trusted their Enigma completely. They could not imagine it being compromised. And yet, at Bletchley Park, a team of codebreakers, mathematicians, classicists, chess players, and linguists had managed to penetrate its secrets, though the work was never finished, never certain, never secure. The story of how they achieved this borders on the legendary. Polish mathematicians had begun the work before the war, and they had passed their knowledge on to the British. A machine called the Bombay, an electromechanical device that could test thousands of possible rotor settings with each passing minute, became the mechanical heart of the operation. But the bomb alone was not enough. Human intuition, pattern recognition, and an almost psychic sense of the German mind were required as well. How would the operator phrase this particular message? What weather report might appear? Which phrases recurred in orders sent to U-boat commanders? These small anchors of certainty could unlock entire transmissions. Picture the routine of it, if you will. Day after day, young women, many of them barely out of school, would sit at desks with sheets of intercepted gibberish before them. The letters seemed random, purposeless, yet they held within them the movements of ships and the orders of death. Operators would test the Bombay settings, watching as electrical contacts raced through thousands of possibilities. When the machine stopped, when it found what might be the correct rotor position, the operator would make a note, and that partial solution would be passed along to the cryptanalysts in the next room. Hour after hour, this dance between human and machine would continue, and when a message was finally broken, when the plain text emerged and revealed its secrets, someone would carry that intelligence to the Naval Intelligence Division in London, where it would be evaluated and acted upon. The impact on convoy routing was direct and profound, though it remained cloaked in secrecy so complete that few of the merchant sailors themselves understood why their ships took this course rather than that one. A convoy might be ordered to deviate hundreds of miles from its planned route, based on intelligence that came from a single intercepted radio message 2 days prior. The captain would receive his orders, alter course without explanation, and sail on, trusting that there was a reason, that somewhere in the British Admiralty's offices, someone knew something vital that justified the change. Sometimes that trust was rewarded. Sometimes the course deviation placed the convoy directly in the path of danger the Admiralty was trying to avoid. Or worse, sometimes the detour was ordered too late, and the convoy had already entered the kill zone. The delicate nature of this intelligence created a constant tension within the Admiralty's operational planning. Use the intelligence too often, route convoys too deliberately away from U-boat positions, and the Germans might begin to suspect that their Enigma had been compromised. They might abandon the machine entirely and switch to an entirely new cipher that the codebreakers would have to crack from the beginning. So there was a careful calculus involved. Decisions about how much of the intelligence to act upon, which convoys to route away from danger, and which to protect with additional escorts instead, creating a kind of plausible deniability. From the German perspective, some convoys they detected would evade the wolf packs through luck or escort action, not because their positions had been intercepted. It was a dangerous game, played with the lives of merchant sailors as the stakes. By March 1943, when convoys HX-229 and SC-122 were being formed in New York, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park had achieved a remarkable stream of successes. They were regularly reading the Enigma traffic, and the Naval Intelligence Division was providing the Admiralty with reliable information about U-boat dispositions and orders. The movements of the German submarines, their patrol lines, their assigned zones, their gathering wolf packs, all of this could be known, or believed to be known, sometimes hours before the convoys encountered them. It seemed, to those in the Admiralty tasked with routing convoys across the Atlantic, that they had gained a crucial advantage. Intelligence was flowing freely. The codebreakers were delivering the goods. Surely, with such knowledge, the convoys might be routed safely through waters where they could avoid the worst concentrations of U-boat strength. Yet intelligence, no matter how accurate, is never perfectly predictive. It tells you where submarines were positioned when they sent their last radio message. It does not tell you where they are now, not with absolute certainty. It reveals plans and orders, but cannot account for initiative, luck, or the improvisation of commanders in the field. And there was another complication, darker and more troubling, one that the codebreakers would not fully grasp until it was too late. Meanwhile, in the quiet rooms of Bletchley Park, where the Enigma machines hummed and clicked with their inscrutable logic, something unprecedented had begun to shift. The walls were lined with banks of bomb bays, those electromechanical minds that had for months been reading the German naval cipher 4 with remarkable regularity, catching the whispered orders of Admiral Dönitz as they travelled through the ether to his scattered wolf packs beneath the waves. But in early March, as our two convoys were being assembled on opposite sides of the Atlantic, the codebreakers encountered something they had not anticipated. A change in the German encryption system, a new rotor setting, a complication that would, for a brief and uncertain stretch of days, leave them blind to the movements of the very submarines that posed the greatest threat to the merchant ships, now lumbering eastward across the ocean. This was not an unknown phenomenon. The Germans had made adjustments before, small refinements to keep their communications secure, and each time the brilliant minds at Bletchley had worked through the problem with patience and ingenuity. But this particular modification, introduced in February and fully operational by early March, proved more stubborn than its predecessors. The bombs would need to be adjusted, or perhaps rebuilt. The rotor sequences would need to be discovered anew, and while that painstaking work began, carried out by mathematicians and young women with extraordinary pattern recognition and an almost meditative capacity for repetitive analysis, the German U-boat dispositions became, for the first time in many months, uncertain. Picture, if you will, the tension this created, though it was a tension felt only by those who understood its implications. To the sailors aboard the merchant vessels, there was no perceptible change. They continued their routines, checking their cargo manifests, maintaining their stations, eating their meager rations in the forecastles and saloon cabins. They did not know that the intelligence apparatus that had been carefully coordinating their routing, steering them around known concentrations of enemy submarines, was now operating with less precision. But those in the corridors of the Admiralty in London, those who received daily or near-daily updates on U-boat positions, found themselves looking at charts with new gaps in them, question marks in the North Atlantic, stretches of sea where the enemy could be, but where they could not say with certainty. What would unfold, though neither Bletchley nor the Admiralty could have known it, was almost a cruel timing. The intelligence gap that opened in early March was narrow, only a few days, a week perhaps, but it would close at almost the precise moment when the convoys HX-229 and SC-122 were entering the very region where the U-boats waited. Later, historians and veterans would reflect on this, with the clarity that only hindsight provides. Was it coincidence? Was it the inevitable collision of two vast and complex systems in motion? Or was there something in the nature of war itself that drew such moments together, the fog of intelligence and the fog of the Atlantic becoming one? For now, though, in those transitional days of early March, Allied intelligence officers noted the blackout with the professional concern it deserved. Reports came in from direction-finding stations along the British coast, those arrays of antennas that could triangulate the locations of German radio transmissions. But the volume of information was reduced. The clarity was diminished. It was as if someone had drawn a curtain across a portion of the map, and the people responsible for moving chess pieces across it would have to make their decisions with less information than they had grown accustomed to. The convoys were routed according to the best estimates available, the historical patterns of U-boat activity, the reports from other sources, the educated guesses of experienced officers. But guesses, no matter how educated, are still guesses. There was something almost poignant about this moment, suspended between the known and the unknown. The Germans, for their part, had no idea that their new encryption was causing any difficulty at all. From Berlin, from Dönitz's headquarters, the orders continued to flow in what they believed was complete security. The Raubgraf, Stürmer, and Dränger wolf packs were being positioned with meticulous care. The ambush was being prepared. But those preparing it could not know that their enemy, for a brief window, could not see their hands moving, and the Allies, for their part, knew that something was hidden from them, but not what, and not where. This is a peculiar kind of anxiety, the anxiety of missing information. It is perhaps more unsettling than obvious danger, because it allows for the imagination to fill the spaces that knowledge should occupy. When you can see your enemy clearly on a map, you can prepare. You can route around him. But when his position is unknown, when he could be anywhere in a vast expanse of ocean, there is a kind of helplessness that settles over the planning tables. And yet, life goes on. Decisions must be made. Ships must sail, cargoes must be delivered. The convoys then proceeded with their escorts through the cold waters of the North Atlantic into a region where the danger was real and present, even if the exact nature and location of that danger could not be precisely charted on a map in a dry room thousands of miles away. The men aboard the merchant vessels did not know this, of course. They would not learn until much later, if ever, that their journey was taking place during a rare moment when Allied intelligence had been rendered partially blind. For them, the anxiety, if they felt it at all, came from different sources. From the weather, from the grinding routine of life at sea, from the distant knowledge that submarines existed, and that they hunted in these waters, and that the line between safety and disaster could be crossed in seconds, without warning, in the cold and the dark. By mid-March, the two convoys had begun their crossing in earnest, separated by perhaps a day's sailing at the standard convoy speed of 9 knots. SC-122 had departed New York carrying its cargo of steel, grain, ammunition, and general supplies, bound for Swansea and Liverpool, the usual destinations when ships needed to sustain the island nation and feed its armies. HX-229 followed behind, a faster convoy in theory, though rarely able to exceed the speed of its slowest vessel, which was rather the point of sailing in organized columns. The ships had moved across the coastal waters, past the eastern seaboard, where the threat of U-boats patrolling near American ports had diminished somewhat since the days of 1942, when the submarines had operated with near impunity in sight of land. But now, as the days accumulated and the ships pressed eastward into the open ocean, the waters around them began to feel different. The hustle and noise of port life had faded entirely. The ships were alone now, or rather, they were alone together, a congregation of steel and wood and human beings moving through an immensity of salt water that seemed to care nothing for their survival. This was the Atlantic proper, the grey expanse between the two continents where the protective umbrella of land-based aviation began to withdraw. For the men aboard these vessels, and they were predominantly men, from grey-haired captains to powder monkeys barely 16, The experience of crossing the Atlantic in wartime had become routine to the point of danger. Routine bred inattention. Inattention bred casualties. And yet, there was something almost meditative about those long days at sea, particularly when no threat was immediately visible. A merchant sailor or Navy escort sailor might stand a 4-hour watch, scanning the horizon for the telltale smoke of a distant ship or the impossible wake of a periscope. Hours would pass with nothing but the thrum of engines, the cry of seabirds that had somehow found themselves far from land, the constant creak of the vessel as it worked against the swells. The North Atlantic in March offered no warmth. The air was cold, often damp, and the spray that occasionally found its way across the deck stung the skin with salt and the promise of worse weather to come. The convoys, numbering together more than 100 ships when combined, stretched across perhaps 30 or 40 square miles of ocean, a vast aggregation that was nonetheless a small target in the face of the Atlantic's true dimensions. They moved in their ordained formations, arranged into columns as if they were soldiers on a parade ground, except that soldiers did not have to maintain precise spacing while riding 6-foot swells and fighting against cross-currents. The columns had names. The lead was sometimes the position of honor, or sometimes the position of greatest danger, depending on which direction the threat came from. The slower ships, the real workhorses, the tramps and general cargo vessels, occupied the center and sides. Faster ships, or those carrying particularly vital cargo, might be placed somewhat forward or aft. Everything depended on the Commodore's judgment, the senior merchant captain designated to coordinate the convoy's movements. He issued orders by flag signals and radio, trying to maintain the delicate balance of cohesion without allowing any ship to fall so far behind that it became separated, isolated, and therefore vulnerable. Here, in this space between the last reliable air cover from North America and the first possible reach of Allied aircraft based in the British Isles, a curious geography of danger reasserted itself. The air gap, as it was known in the parlance of the Admiralty and among the merchant service, represented a zone of perhaps 500 miles or more, depending on aircraft performance and weather. It was the blind spot in the Allies' defenses, the one place where convoy escorts and their charges operated in almost complete vulnerability to U-boat attack and utterly without protection from the air. Yes, there might be a few corvettes and minesweepers attached to the convoy, perhaps a single destroyer or frigate if they were fortunate, but these vessels were pitifully few in number when measured against the potential threat. They could hunt a U-boat if they could locate one, but locating a submarine in thousands of square miles of open ocean was less a matter of skill and more a matter of improbable luck. The submarines, by contrast, could search for the convoys with greater ease. They had been directed toward these waters by radio signals from shore, by intercepts and calculations, and the accumulated knowledge of where merchantmen were likely to travel. The U-boats were patient hunters, and the air gap was their hunting ground. As the merchant ships pushed deeper into mid-Atlantic, the reality of this vulnerability began to settle in, though not in the form of panic or explicit fear. Rather, it manifested as a kind of heightened awareness, a subtle shift in the rhythm of shipboard routine. Men who would normally have relaxed into the monotony of a long watch now found themselves more alert, listening perhaps a bit more intently to every change in engine sound, studying the horizon with greater focus even though nothing had appeared there in days. The officers and professional sailors knew what the statistics meant, even if they did not speak of them directly. A merchant sailor, or an able seaman, assigned to a ship crossing the Atlantic in 1943, had roughly one chance in 4 or 5 of surviving the war unscathed. The odds improved if you were quick, if you were observant, if you were extraordinarily fortunate. They worsened if your ship was slow, if it was carrying ammunition, if it was in the center of a formation rather than on the edge. Some men had ridden the Atlantic many times and felt themselves almost invulnerable through the weight of experience alone, though experience in wartime was often a misleading guide. Others were on their first or second crossing and carried with them the acute anxiety of the inexperienced, the terrible awareness that they had never seen what a torpedo did to a ship, had never felt the lurch of a vessel struck below the waterline, had never known the specific sound a man made when the ocean poured into his lungs. Food aboard these vessels during the long crossing tended toward the monotonous: corned beef, hard biscuits, powdered potatoes, occasionally fresh bread if the ship's bakery was functioning. The meals were designed for calories and durability rather than pleasure or variety. Smoking was perhaps the most reliable distraction, a way for sailors to mark the passage of time and to give their hands something to do during hours of enforced stillness. The smell of tobacco smoke mixed with diesel oil and salt spray became the atmosphere of a crossing ship, as distinctive as any place on Earth, and yet utterly taken for granted by the men who inhabited it. Below decks, in the engine rooms of these merchant vessels, the heat and noise and vibration created an environment so profound and so total that a man stationed there could scarcely imagine what was happening above, could only feel the rhythm of the vessel's work and trust that the ship was moving in the right direction and that nothing terrible was unfolding overhead. This compartmentalization, this separation of the ship into distinct and mostly isolated spaces, meant that when something did go wrong, different men would experience it in radically different ways. Think for a moment about what the crossing of the air gap actually meant in practical terms for these ships and their crews. They were moving at 9 knots, a modest pace that would require 6 or 7 days to traverse from one side of this vulnerable zone to the other. 6 or 7 days of expecting attack, of listening to reports from other ships in the convoy about distant sightings, of gradually accumulating fatigue in a way that was both physical and psychological. The escorts moved constantly around the formation, weaving back and forth in a pattern that was meant to convey the impression of vigilance, but was in reality largely symbolic. A corvette, a small naval vessel designed for anti-submarine work and not much more, could chase down a U-boat if it detected one, but it could not be everywhere at once, and it certainly could not protect a 100-ship convoy spread across dozens of square miles of ocean. The radio discipline imposed upon the convoys added another layer of discomfort, for merchant ships were accustomed to a steady chatter of communication, and the requirement for near-total silence in radio transmissions meant that captains and first officers often had no idea what was happening at the far end of the formation. If a ship was sunk on the opposite side of the convoy, the merchant captain might never know it until well after his own vessel had passed by the wreckage. The waiting itself became a kind of slow pressure. There was nothing to do but continue, nothing to change, no maneuver that would significantly increase safety or speed the crossing. The ships were committed now, committed to their course and their formation, vulnerable in a way that was almost impossible to mitigate through action. Instead, mitigation came through vigilance that was often ultimately futile, through the meticulous maintenance of formation that would not prevent a determined U-boat attack, through the quiet knowledge among the officers that if the submarines found them in sufficient numbers, very little could be done to prevent significant losses. And yet the convoys moved onward, day after day, their smoke columns rising into the grey March sky, their wakes trailing behind them like pale scars across the water's surface. The men aboard them lived with this knowledge and tried not to dwell upon it, because dwelling upon it served no practical purpose and could only erode the fragile mental equilibrium required to maintain a calm demeanor in front of crew and passengers alike. The ocean itself seemed indifferent to human concerns. The weather in March could be treacherous, with storms materializing from the northwest with little warning and forcing the convoy to heave to or to slow its advance even further, which itself was a kind of secondary torment. A ship that was slowed or stopped became an easier target, a more stationary point in the water that a U-boat could track and intercept. And yet a ship in a convoy could not simply run ahead of the others. The whole point of a convoy, the entire reason for the rigid discipline and the formation sailing and the careful coordination, was that together the ships were stronger than alone. Separated, they would be picked off one by one. Together, they had at least the statistical possibility that some would survive and some would reach port. It was this mathematics of collective survival, this acceptance of risk as the price of increasing the odds of reaching Britain, that defined the crossing of the air gap. The danger was not imminent, not visible, not immediate in most moments of most days. It was instead a pressure that accumulated, a weight that grew heavier as the hours passed and the convoys drew closer to their mid-Atlantic nadir, the point where they were furthest from any possible air assistance, and therefore most exposed to the hunting submarines that were even now beginning to position themselves for what would become, over the next several days, one of the largest convoy battles of the entire Atlantic War. Out in the vastness between Newfoundland and the Irish coast, where the water deepens to a colour that has no name, the crossing proceeded with that peculiar mixture of monotony and dread that defined each day on the open Atlantic. The ships moved in their deliberate formations, neither fast nor slow, bound together by the simple necessity of numbers. Somewhere in that cold expanse of rolling grey, a pair of eyes, human eyes, guided by mathematics and radio signals, were about to change everything. It was the morning of March 16, 1943, when the first U-boat scout made contact. The submarine U-221, under the command of Hans Baumann, surfaced in the pale light of the North Atlantic dawn and sent a brief, crackling radio signal back toward Berlin. 2 convoys had been spotted, the message said. 2 slow-moving herds of merchant vessels moving eastward through the shipping lanes. Within hours, those few spoken words over the radio would set in motion one of the most coordinated and devastating submarine attacks of the entire war. At the German naval headquarters in Paris, the message reached the desk of Konteradmiral Eberhard Gott, the chief of the U-boat operations staff. He understood immediately what this meant. The U-boats had been waiting, scattered across the North Atlantic in patrol lines, searching for weeks with frustrating patience. This was the moment. Not one convoy, but 2, traveling relatively close to one another. The possibility for a coordinated, large-scale attack was suddenly, magnificently, available. Gott made his decision swiftly. He began to concentrate every submarine he could gather toward those 2 convoys. The radio signals went out, and submarines began to alter course, moving toward the waters where HX-229 and SC-122 were making their slow, inevitable way across the ocean. What was forming, piece by piece, order by order, was a gathering of wolf packs, coordinated groups of submarines operating under a unified strategy, hunting together as if by instinct rather than mere instruction. The first pack to be directed toward the convoys was designated Raubgraf, which translates loosely as robber count, a name that carries a certain dark poetry to it. These submarines were ordered to take up positions along the anticipated path of the convoys, creating a barrier that nothing could pass through without encountering them. Simultaneously, 2 other packs were mobilized, Stürmer, meaning stormer, and Dränger, meaning something closer to pusher or impeller. Each pack represented perhaps 15 to 20 submarines in total, though not all were immediately available. Each command represented submarines of varying capability, captained by men with different levels of experience and training. What you must understand is that these were not random submarines sent in hope of stumbling upon targets. This was a coordinated strategy. The U-boats were being positioned like pieces on a chessboard by an unseen hand far away in Paris, guided by the intercepts and the position reports that came from scouts like U-221. Once a convoy was sighted, the entire apparatus of German submarine command could pivot and concentrate. It was, in its own terrible way, a remarkably sophisticated system of naval coordination for the time. The wolves were gathering now, moving through waters that were becoming steadily colder as the convoys pushed deeper into the North Atlantic. Each submarine captain received his orders with a mixture of anticipation and grim awareness. They knew that merchant convoys typically had some form of escort, though escorts were always limited in number. They knew that the crossing would take several more days. They knew that the waters ahead represented their best opportunity in months to inflict significant damage on the enemy's supply lines. There is something almost meditative, in a strange way, about reading the words of submarine captains from this period. Many of them kept detailed logs, and in those logs you find men trying to describe the peculiar psychology of submarine warfare. The waiting was often the hardest part. Hours and hours of slow motion through the water, listening to the throb of the diesels, scanning the horizon with periscopes, the minds of the crew on edge, though nothing was yet happening. But now, at last, there was something happening. Now there was a purpose, a direction, a target. By the afternoon of March 16th, more contact reports were coming in. Other U-boats in the vicinity had picked up the convoy signals or had been directed toward the reported sightings. The three wolf packs, Raubgraf, Stürmer, and Dränger, were being woven together into something larger than any one pack could be. It was a convergence that had been rehearsed many times before, theoretically, but never in quite such scale or with such intensity of focus. Command Berlin was pulling every available resource toward this one problem, these two convoys that were moving across the water with the slow inevitability of ships that could not turn back, could not hide, could not flee. Meanwhile, aboard the merchant ships of HX-229 and SC-122, the sailors went about their daily work. They checked ropes and cargo. They stood their watches in the cold wind. They ate their rationed food in the galley, warmed by steam pipes and crowded with exhausted men. The radio operators listened to the static and the occasional message. The captains and commodores consulted their charts and their current positions. None of them knew yet what was being assembled against them. None of them could have fully comprehended, even if they had been told, the number of submarines that were being directed toward their course. But the machinery was in motion now. The Germans had made their decision. The wolf packs were being assembled. The question was no longer whether an attack would come, but only when, and with what force. The crossing of the Atlantic, which had been a long, slow ordeal of discomfort and vigilance, was about to become something far more dangerous. The noise of the convoys, their engines, their wakes, the sounds of countless ships moving together, would soon attract predators from below. The waiting was ending. The reckoning was about to begin. The night of March 16th fell over the Atlantic, with the kind of darkness that seems to erase the boundary between sea and sky, a blackness so complete that men on deck could barely distinguish the shape of the ship ahead in their own column. The convoys had been crossing for nearly 2 weeks by this point, and the rhythm of their days had settled into an almost meditative routine, watches changing, engines thrumming, the endless creak and groan of hulls responding to the swell. But that evening, something shifted in the air. The radio operators on the escort vessels had picked up signals, fragmentary and troubling, hints that U-boats were converging from multiple directions. No alarm was sounded yet. Convoy procedure demanded a certain discipline of silence, a protocol of invisibility that required ships to maintain their stations without lights, without radio chatter, with only the occasional dim signal lamp speaking in codes that only the initiated could read. Around midnight, the first torpedo struck. It was the ship Hyperion, a British steamer carrying grain and timber, and the explosion that tore through her hull was not the clean, cinematically distant burst that one might imagine from a distance, but rather a wrenching, intimate catastrophe. Men sleeping in bunks below were thrown from their cots. The ship's structure twisted with a sound like metal tearing, and within moments, Hyperion had developed a fatal list. On the bridge, the captain made the decision to order abandon ship, but in the confusion of darkness and the sudden violence, the routine of evacuation became chaos. Some lifeboats swung out on their davits properly. Others spilled men into the water. The ship would sink within the hour, and in that dark Atlantic, cold far below freezing, the mathematics of survival became brutally simple. But Hyperion was only the beginning. Within the space of perhaps 30 minutes, the night erupted with successive explosions. The Sagamore was hit, then the Empire March. Then the William Eustis, an American Liberty ship, took a torpedo that detonated in her hold and split her nearly in two. The convoys, which had been maintaining their disciplined spacing, SC-122 and HX-229, still technically separate, although their routes were converging and they were beginning to occupy nearly the same stretch of ocean, suddenly became something far more chaotic. Ships that had been sailing in orderly columns were now scrambling to maintain their positions while their neighbors burned or sank. The darkness that had provided some measure of security now became a source of terror, because in that darkness a ship's captain could see only the glow of fire from burning vessels nearby, could only guess at what was happening to the rest of the convoy. The escort vessels, of which there were pitifully few, were attempting to respond. The corvettes and minesweepers that had been positioned around the perimeter of the convoy were racing toward the positions of the U-boats based on the direction from which the torpedoes seemed to have come. But submarine warfare, in March 1943, was still largely a matter of educated guessing. The corvette HMS Campion was among the escort, as were the trawlers used as makeshift minesweepers, and they fired depth charges into the darkness, their explosions adding to the already nightmarish confusion. But depth charges, even when they were detonated near a U-boat, were as much about psychology and disruption as about actual destruction. A U-boat captain operating on the surface at night, conducting a wolf-pack attack, could often dive, slip away, and then circle around for another attack vector. The convoy, meanwhile, was virtually defenseless. The merchant ships had been fitted with some defensive guns, 4-inch guns on many of the larger vessels, the occasional Oerlikons, but these weapons were designed for surface targets, not for submarines operating in darkness from beneath the water. What was perhaps most disorienting was the way the two convoys were beginning to merge. SC-122 had been slightly ahead and to the north, but the routes of both convoys across the Atlantic were converging, and some of the faster ships from HX-229 were beginning to catch up to stragglers and damaged vessels from SC-122. The escort vessels that belonged to SC-122 and those that belonged to HX-229 were being drawn together into an increasingly compressed defensive zone, still separated administratively, still commanded by different commodores, yet increasingly forced to operate as a single, larger target. And that, from the perspective of a U-boat Wolfpack commander observing on the surface from several miles away, was precisely the point. Karl Dernitz's Wolfpack strategy relied on the ability to detect a convoy, mass submarines around it from multiple directions, and concentrate attacks during darkness when the U-boats could operate on the surface with relative impunity. The closer the convoys came together, the more target-rich the environment became. The night stretched on with an almost unbearable quality of unpredictability. Lookouts on the escorting warships strained their eyes into the darkness, listening as much as looking, because sometimes a U-boat's presence could be sensed only by sound, the diesel engines or electric motors of a submarine, the splash of a wake, or the distant phosphorescence of disturbed water. Ships that had been hit were calling for assistance on the radio, using frequencies that everyone knew the enemy could monitor. Lifeboats and rafts were being launched. Some vessels, remarkably, attempted to maintain their convoy positions even as they were damaged or sinking, a kind of adherence to protocol that speaks to how deeply ingrained the discipline of convoy sailing had become. Other captains, seeing what was happening, made the decision to edge away from the columns, hoping that separation from the main body might offer some margin of safety. Do you wonder what it must have felt like to be a merchant sailor in those dark hours, knowing that the ship beneath your feet could be shattered at any moment by an explosion you would not see coming? The men who were not on deck or in the lifeboats, who were trapped below in engine rooms or cargo holds, would have heard the impact of a torpedo not as a distant, abstract thing, but as an immediate, violent shock to the entire structure around them. Some of them would have been killed instantly. Others would have been trapped as flooding rushed through the compartments, or as ships capsized in the darkness. The water of the Atlantic in March is not merely cold. It is a cold that renders a human body incapable of voluntary action within minutes. The paralysis is not philosophical but physiological. The nervous system simply ceases to respond. By the early hours of March 17th, multiple vessels from both convoys had been sunk or mortally damaged. The darkness was filled with the sound of sirens and ships' whistles, the cries of men in the water, the roar of fires burning on the surface of the ocean, and the ongoing thunder of depth-charge explosions as the escort vessels continued their largely futile efforts to drive the U-boats away. The confusion was nearly total. Officers on the escort vessels were struggling to understand what was happening, to count how many ships had been hit, to coordinate with each other across the radio while attempting to maintain the sort of tactical silence that prevented the enemy from fixing their positions too precisely. Meanwhile, the convoy itself was disintegrating. Ships that had maintained their careful station-keeping for 2 weeks were now scattered, some continuing forward, some stopping to render assistance to the wounded, some abandoning their cargoes and heading for the nearest neutral or allied port that might offer shelter. And somewhere in that vast stretch of dark ocean, more U-boats were maneuvering into position. The wolf pack was not exhausted. The night had only just truly begun. Among those ships caught in the darkness that March night was the Southern Princess, a British steamer of modest means, not especially fast or large, the kind of vessel that carried the unglamorous cargo of war, manganese ore, steel plating, the raw materials that factories needed to forge the weapons of survival. She had crossed this route before. Her crew knew the rhythm of these runs, the way the ship's engine settled into its predictable throb, the salt-stained routine of watches and meals taken quickly in the wardroom. When the torpedo struck her starboard side, somewhere between midnight and the first grey hour of morning, the explosion wasn't necessarily unexpected. Every man aboard had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times, yet it was still profound in its violence, shaking the entire frame of the ship like a great hand had simply grabbed hold and shaken it. The Southern Princess listed almost immediately. There was no time for the kind of orderly evacuation that the drills suggested. A radio man named Thomas, a young man from Liverpool who had written a letter to his mother the evening before that he would never mail, made his way to the radio room one last time to send the distress signal, his fingers finding the Morse key through muscle memory and fear, dots and dashes that said, "We are sinking, we are here, we are going down into the dark water." The lifeboats were lowered into a sea that was cold in a way that seems almost abstract to describe, a temperature that steals the breath and that erases thought. Some of the lifeboats made it away from the ship cleanly, others didn't. One crew member, a carpenter's mate named William, managed to reach a lifeboat, but his hands were so cold he couldn't grip the rope properly, and he fell back into the water, and the lifeboat moved away from him into the darkness. And what happened next is something the survivors carried with them for the rest of their lives, a silence that couldn't quite be spoken aloud, the weight of having been unable to reach back far enough. The night brought other ships into ruin. The Kingsbury, a refrigerated cargo vessel, caught fire after her torpedo strike, flames rising up her superstructure in an almost luminous orange against the black Atlantic, visible for miles around. And the flames were actually a kind of strange relief, because for those moments you could see something, anything, after so long in the dark. The crew of the Kingsbury abandoned her in good order, the captain ensuring that even in catastrophe there was method, that men didn't simply flee, but evacuated with discipline. When a rescue ship finally located some of the lifeboats in the grey dawn, the survivors were delirious with cold, unable at first to remember their own names, unable to process that they were actually being lifted from the water, that the ordeal had an ending. There was the Esco, another British steamer, and the Arakatica, and the American ship Iroquois, each one a small community of men, firemen tending the boilers deep in the heat and noise of the engine room, radio operators hunched over their equipment, ordinary seamen working on deck, cooks in galleys preparing meals in pots that swung with the ship's roll. Each man had something waiting for him, somewhere. Some had wives who were listening to air raid sirens in port cities. Some had children they'd only seen briefly before shipping out. Some were young enough that they'd never had much of anything waiting for them at all, and the sea was as much a home as anywhere else. These men were not soldiers, yet they were living like soldiers, enduring the same kind of fear and loss. They wore no uniforms. If they were captured or killed, there was less legal protection for them than for uniformed combatants, and they knew this. It was part of the weight they carried. The human moments, the small details that accumulate into the shape of a life being interrupted, these are what the cold statistics sometimes miss. There was a chief engineer aboard one of the lost vessels who had been thinking, just hours before the attack, about how he might apply for shore leave once the convoy reached port. He'd been calculating what he might save, what his wife might do with an extra month of his wages. There was a young lad, barely 18, working as a deckhand on the Southern Princess, making his second crossing, still learning the names of the ropes and the proper way to coil them, and he was among those who survived, though he never returned to the sea after the war ended. The memory of that cold water, too profound for him ever to reconcile with the work. There was a radio operator aboard the Olphin who managed to get the distress signal out before the ship went under, and he was one of the few from that vessel who made it into the lifeboats, and he would spend the rest of his life grateful for the accident of positioning, the simple fact that he'd been close to a lifeboat when the moment came. The rescues themselves were chaos and grace mingled together. The escort ships, the corvettes and minesweepers that were supposed to be protecting these convoys, were desperately trying to pull survivors from the water, but they too were under threat, and picking up survivors meant slowing down, becoming a target. Some ships' captains made the agonizing choice to continue on, to not rescue those in the water, understanding that their primary duty was to the convoy itself, to the bulk of the cargo and crew still afloat. This decision would haunt them. There's a particular kind of anguish that comes from leaving men behind, from hearing their calls in the darkness and choosing to sail onward. Some captains did stop. Some did manage to pull men from the water, to wrap them in blankets, to give them hot tea and the overwhelming relief of solid deck beneath their feet. The word spread through the surviving crews, passed between lifeboats in the grey morning light. Help is coming. There are ships looking for us. We're not alone out here. By the time the dawn broke fully on that second day of intensive attacks, the mathematics of the battle were becoming clear, though no one could yet see the whole shape of it. 13 ships from SC-122 and HX-229 had been lost. Over 100 men were dead or missing. Hundreds more were surviving in lifeboats, clinging to life rafts, waiting in the cold water for rescue that might or might not arrive. And among the survivors, there was something almost like a state of shock, a kind of numbness that comes from having passed through something so utterly beyond normal experience that the mind seems to move slowly, as if it too is struggling through cold water, as if it requires immense effort just to process that you are still alive. While the merchant ships themselves carried precious cargo across an ocean, now painted with fire and wreckage, there remained a small handful of naval vessels whose task was almost impossible. These were the escort ships, and their captains and crews would bear the weight of decisions made in seconds, in darkness, with lives hanging on every choice. The escorts were few, too few, in the thinking of everyone involved, though especially in the thinking of the men who commanded them. The corvettes of the Royal Canadian Navy and the British Navy were small, tough vessels, designed more for endurance than firepower. The Trillium, the Dauphin, the Rosthern, these were the names of ships that would face the wolf pack in the dark. Built on merchant hulls, retrofitted with depth charges and simple sonar, they displaced perhaps 1,500 tons. To a U-boat commander watching through a periscope, they would have seemed like gnats buzzing around an elephant. Yet to the merchant sailors in the columns behind them, these small grey ships were everything. They were the only thing standing between the convoy and the abyss. The corvette captains and their commanding officers, these were men stretched beyond the ordinary limits of human endurance. Some were reserve officers, civilians in uniform only months before. Some were career naval men hardened by years of this same monotonous, terrifying work. All of them understood the mathematics of their position. A typical ocean escort group for a convoy this size consisted of perhaps 6 or 7 vessels. To cover a convoy that might stretch across several miles of open water, with merchantmen arranged in orderly columns, meant each escorting warship was responsible for protecting far too much sea. The coverage was thin, the gaps were numerous, and into those gaps the U-boats came. The rhythm of escort duty during an attack was something altogether different from the rhythm of crossing. Once the first torpedo had struck, once the first ship had lit the night sky with flame and oil smoke, the escorts ceased to be shepherds and became firefighters, hunters, defenders. The commanding officer of an escort faced choices that compressed into moments what would normally take hours of deliberation. Do you pursue the U-boat that just fired, diving deep into the darkness to attack with depth charges, hoping to disable or destroy it? Or do you remain with the convoy itself, using your small presence to deter further attacks, to try to establish a protective screen? The mathematics of this choice never resolved cleanly. Choose to hunt, and you might remove one threat from the water, but leave the convoy undefended. Stay with the convoy, and the U-boat that just struck remains free to reload, to circle, to attack again. Hour after hour, sometimes for 2 days and nights without rest, the escort commanders remained on their bridges, watching through darkness so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. The exhaustion accumulated like frost. The decisions had to keep coming. Around them, their crews, young men in their 20s, many of them conscripted from fishing villages or pressed into service from merchant vessels themselves, worked depth charge patterns, maintained sonar watches, stood lookout through the cold and wind and spray. A corvette in heavy seas would pitch and heave violently. The motion was relentless. Men grew queasy not from fear, but from the simple physics of standing on a deck that rose and fell in an 8-second rhythm for hours without pause. The depth charges themselves were blunt instruments. A corvette could carry perhaps 80 of these cylindrical explosives, each weighing hundreds of pounds, set to detonate at depths guessed at from sonar readings that were themselves uncertain. They would plunge into the dark water and detonate in patterns designed to create lethal pressure waves. Sometimes this worked. More often, it simply announced the presence of the escort to the U-boat, which would then dive deeper, move away, wait for another opportunity. Each depth charge fired represented resources spent, noise made, position revealed. The escorts were constrained by limited ammunition, limited fuel, limited information. They were forced to make war against an enemy they could barely see, with tools that rarely worked as cleanly as doctrine suggested they should. The captain of the Rosthern, or the Trillium, or any of the other escorts, would have stood on his bridge in the small hours of those nights, perhaps 3 in the morning, or 4, and felt the impossible weight of responsibility. The convoy he protected represented weeks of preparation, months of loading in American shipyards, the labor and resources of entire nations. Each merchantman was also a story, a crew of 40 or 50 men, or perhaps fewer, who had volunteered or been assigned to cross this ocean, knowing that death was a genuine possibility. The escort captain could see those ships burning, could watch them list and sink, and know that his decisions, or his limitations, or the simple shortage of vessels and weapons had contributed to that outcome. This knowledge did not paralyze most of them. It seemed instead to sharpen their focus, to make them more determined, but it also wore at them in ways that would not fully manifest until the voyage ended and they returned to port. The exhaustion was not merely physical. It was a spiritual weariness that came from repeating the same calculations over and over. Numbers of ships still in the convoy, number of torpedoes heard, number of escorts available, number of hours remaining until air cover could arrive. The escort commander was a shepherd with 6 or 7 dogs, trying to protect a flock of 25 or 30 sheep, spread across a pasture many miles wide, with wolves constantly emerging from fog. Some of those sheep would be taken no matter what the dogs did. This was understood. But the effort to minimize losses, to try to save as many as possible, drove the escorts on through the night. By the time the U-boats began their coordinated assault on the merged remnants of SC-122 and HX-229, the escort crews had already endured days of heightened alert, of false alarms and genuine scares, of standing watch in cold and darkness. The attack, when it came fully, did not bring relief. It brought only more work, more decisions, more losses, more calculations made under conditions of incomplete information and profound fatigue. Yet the escorts persisted. This was what they were there for. This was what the nations had built these small ships and trained these young men to do. And yet, as the night deepened and the first explosions lit the darkness, we might pause and wonder about the hands that gripped the wheels in those wheelhouses, the voices that called orders across the steel decks, the men who were not soldiers and never wanted to be, but who had chosen, or been chosen, to cross the North Atlantic in wartime. The merchant mariners of the Second World War occupied a peculiar and often overlooked corner of the conflict. They were not enlisted. They wore no uniform issued by any military authority. They answered to captains and company officers, not admirals, and yet in many ways their burden exceeded that of the uniformed sailors around them, because they knew, with a clarity that comes only from experience, that if their ship went down, the rescue might be hours away. The life jacket might be all that stood between them and the cold pull of the Atlantic. Most of these men were not young. Contemporary records suggest that merchant crews in 1943 skewed older than their naval counterparts. Men in their 40s and 50s who had already survived decades at sea, who had weathered the depression by staying at sea, because at least at sea there was work. Some were in their 60s, veterans of the First World War, masters and engineers who had seen maritime conflict before and chose to serve again. They were professionals, in the truest sense. They knew the ships they crewed as intimately as they knew their own breathing. But there were younger men too. Boys, really, in their late teens and early 20s, apprentices and ordinary seamen from Liverpool and Glasgow, from Hamburg before the war, turned them into enemies, from Italian ports and Scandinavian fishing villages. Some had come to the sea because their fathers had. Others had come because the land offered nothing. The sea was work, and work in 1943, even dangerous work, was a form of salvation. The messmen, the trimmer who kept the boilers fed, the donkey men and greasers deep in the engine room where the heat never ceased, and the noise was a constant thing that became like silence if you lived in it long enough. They came from the working classes of a dozen nations. Some were Chinese or Lascari sailors, men from Southeast Asia who had signed aboard in peacetime and found themselves trapped by war, unable to return home, dependent on the companies that employed them and the captains who held their papers. Some accounts suggest they were paid less than European crew members for the same work, another small indignity stacked upon the central indignity of having to cross a war zone for a paycheck. There was an odd democracy to it, though, or something approaching it. The chief engineer and the galley boy would eat in the same crowded mess, though at different times and from different rations. The captain might come from a wealthy shipping family or from a small fishing port. The first mate might be working his way toward command over a lifetime. The quartermaster steering the ship had skills that could not be improvised, and in their own way, they knew they were valuable. The ship depended on them. What strikes us, as we consider these lives, is the peculiar knowledge these men carried. They understood something that landlocked people, even soldiers in barracks, did not fully grasp, that the ocean offers no second chances, no appeal, no possibility of compromise. The cold is absolute, the dark is complete. The ship either floats or it does not. And you are either on the ship when it floats, or you are in the water, and from there, your possibilities narrow very quickly. Yet they came. Month after month, they gathered at the docks, they signed the articles, they walked up the gangways of vessels bound for dangerous waters. Why? We can speculate, quietly, about the pull of profession, about the fact that merchant seafaring was what they knew, that standing on the bridge or in the engine room was where they felt competent and real. Perhaps for some, there was an element of defiance, a quiet insistence that Hitler and his U-boats would not take the Atlantic from them, would not stop the ships from running. Perhaps there was simply no better choice available. The land was home, but the sea was livelihood, and in wartime, livelihood is survival. The pay was better than it had been in the Depression. That is worth acknowledging. Wartime service hazard bonuses, what were called war bonuses, made the risk marginally more worthwhile. A merchant seaman crossing the Atlantic in 1943 might earn an extra £1 or £2 per week because of the danger, and for men accustomed to lean times, that mattered. It was not much. It could not truly be compensation for the knowledge that you might die, but it was something. Some of these men kept diaries. Some wrote letters they never sent. In the brief hours of rest between watches, in the close quarters where 8 or 10 men might sleep in rotating shifts, they thought of home, of wives and children they had left, of mothers growing older, of the pubs where they would drink if they returned. They thought of the moment when the ship would dock and they could walk on land again, feel solid earth beneath their feet, sleep in a bed that did not move. But while they were at sea, they worked. They stood their watch. The stoker in the engine room monitored pressure gauges and the temperature of the water jacket around the boilers. The lookout on the bridge scanned the horizon, trying to see shapes in the darkness that might resolve into the silhouettes of submarines. The helmsman kept the ship steady on its course, responding to minute adjustments signaled down from the wheelhouse. The boatswain managed the hatches and the rigging, and the constant small repairs that any ship accumulates. The radio operator, often alone in his cabin, listened to the frequency they had been assigned, waiting for orders, for distress calls, for the routine traffic that bound the convoy together across the emptiness. And at night, especially on the clear nights when the moon was high, They would gather on deck during their breaks, those who could, and smoke cigarettes and speak in low voices about things that had nothing to do with the war, about the girl they left behind, about the house they wanted to buy after the war, about the meal they were going to eat, about whether Everton could win the league if the war ever ended and football came back. Small things, human things, the things that keep a person alive, even when the ocean around them is full of danger. They were not supposed to be heroes. The maritime service did not encourage that kind of thinking. They were professional sailors doing a job, and yet, in the hours ahead, as their ships climbed the waves and the convoys drove further into the danger zone, they would become heroes whether they wanted to be or not. The choice had already been made simply by signing aboard, by walking up the gangway one more time, knowing what they knew about the war at sea. The night of March 16th descended like ink spreading through water, and in those hours between midnight and dawn, the battle reached a terrible crescendo that neither the merchant sailors nor their escort commanders had fully anticipated, though some had sensed it coming in the way one senses a storm gathering beyond the horizon. The U-boats had been circling for nearly a day by then, reporting positions, coordinating in low whispers across the radio frequencies that the Germans believed secure, and as darkness settled completely over the mid-Atlantic swells, the first concentrated wave of attacks began not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of explosions that seemed almost simultaneous, as though the ocean itself had decided to erupt. The British steamer Lucellum, carrying general cargo in those crowded forward holds, took a torpedo at approximately midnight, and the strike came with such force that it shattered the compartments nearest to the engine room, flooding them in seconds with cold seawater that rose with a terrible inevitability through the dark spaces below deck. The men who were sleeping in the quarters forward, as so many merchant sailors did during their off-watch hours, found themselves suddenly confronted with the choice between remaining where they were or scrambling upward through passageways already flooding, and some made it to the deck to see their ship settling by the bow, while others did not. In the confusion that followed, as lifeboats were uncovered and lowered, a process that takes precious minutes, even when panic is not present, another ship nearby, the Scottish ship Hafnia, was struck as well, and the night began to fracture into multiple simultaneous tragedies unfolding across an ocean too vast for any single person to comprehend. What makes this period so difficult to narrate gently is that there was no single focal point, no dramatic crescendo that resolved itself after a few minutes. Instead, what occurred was a sustained and methodical sequence of attacks spread across nearly 6 hours, during which the U-boat commanders, emboldened by their concentration and the relative ineffectiveness of the escort screen, made repeated passes through the convoy lines. The British corvette HMS Rosthern, a small warship with a crew of only 85 men, was doing what corvettes do in such moments, racing toward the last known position of an attack, dropping depth charges in patterns designed to discourage rather than necessarily to sink the submarines beneath her, buying time for merchant ships to adjust their courses. But the ocean at night during a coordinated wolf-pack assault is a realm of almost unbearable complexity, where signals move slowly, where ships maneuver based on incomplete information, and where the mathematics of naval engagement suddenly become less important than simple luck and positioning. The American steamer Eld, a ship that had crossed the Atlantic 6 times before without serious incident, received a torpedo strike on the morning of the 17th, in those early hours when some men were just beginning to think about dawn, when the longest part of the night seemed finally to be past. The explosion that took her was not immediately fatal to the vessel itself, but it disabled her engines and left her drifting, a helpless target in a convoy that could not stop, could not turn back, could not do anything but maintain its course and speed and leave the damaged ship behind to be rescued or recovered by those who might follow. How many men aboard the Eld made it to the lifeboats? How many spent those next hours in small boats waiting for rescue that seemed perpetually distant? Such details blur in the historical record, yet they represent the immediate consequence of each strike. The sudden transformation from the routine rhythms of sea life into extreme circumstances demanding every ounce of will and luck. Between the attacks themselves came periods of strange waiting, intervals measured in minutes that felt much longer to those enduring them. The escorts would race toward the location of the last incident. Sonar operators would strain to detect the presence of submarines in the darkness below, and the convoy itself would continue its lumbering transit, its multiple columns of cargo ships pressed together more tightly than usual, which paradoxically made them both easier for the U-boats to strike and more difficult to avoid being struck when an attack came. Consider the peculiar torment of being a merchant sailor during such a pause. You have just heard or felt an explosion nearby. You know that ships are being sunk. You understand that your own vessel may be next. And yet you must remain at your post, maintain your course, monitor your instruments, and try to project an appearance of routine, even as your heart might be beating with an intensity you can barely contain. The British ship Nareva, struck during this same terrible night, was being used to carry oranges and potatoes, food bound for the British civilian population that had endured years of rationing and aerial bombardment. When the torpedo hit, and the ship began to settle with a terrible slowness that seemed almost purposeful, the merchant crew, many of them sailors who had done this run countless times, who knew the routes and the risks with the intimate familiarity of people who make their living doing dangerous work, had to decide in moments whether to abandon the vessel or to stay to make final preparations. The Nareva's survivors would later speak of the cold of the water when they finally did go in, of the way the Atlantic in March seemed to steal the breath and the strength almost simultaneously, and of the fragile hope that rescue would come before exhaustion claimed them. The night continued. Ships that had managed to remain unhit, to navigate between the attacks and the depth charges and the chaos, found themselves crowding into different positions, trying to take advantage of what protection the convoy structure still offered. The American ship Henry R. Mallory, another cargo vessel, was struck at approximately 2 in the morning, and her loss added another layer to the accumulating toll of the night. What does it mean to lose a ship in the darkness? It means that men who were preparing food in the galley, men who were on watch in the engine room monitoring the temperature of boilers, men who were sleeping below decks, suddenly had minutes or seconds to understand that everything had changed, that the familiar spaces around them were becoming filled with water, or with fire, or with both, and that survival was now a question without a predetermined answer. The escorts did what they could, which was remarkably little given the tactical situation. They were outnumbered by an unknown factor. Neither the convoy commander nor the escort commander knew exactly how many U-boats were in the wolf pack surrounding them, and this uncertainty itself became a form of torment. With perhaps 5 or 6 U-boats attacking throughout this night, sometimes in sequence, sometimes nearly simultaneously, the small handful of escort vessels found themselves trying to cover an impossibly large area, trying to respond to reports that were often minutes old by the time a corvette could arrive at the position, trying to make decisions based on imperfect information in real time. The historian can examine this night with the benefit of months and years of perspective, but for those enduring it minute by minute, hour by hour, it was simply an overwhelming succession of crises, each one demanding immediate attention, each one carrying the possibility of sudden death or desperate rescue. By the time the first grey light began to appear on the eastern horizon, indicating that dawn was perhaps 2 hours away, approximately 12 ships had been struck or sunk during the concentrated assault on SC-122 and HX-229. 12 vessels, each one carrying food or fuel or ammunition or materials necessary to the prosecution of the war in Europe. each one representing a loss not just in cargo, but in the lives of men, in the families waiting for letters that would never arrive, in the quiet erosion of the resources that Britain needed to continue fighting. The U-boat commanders, exhausted themselves, would begin to withdraw as the possibility of long-range air cover grew closer, as the sun approached and the water transformed from the absolute darkness that had sheltered them into the pale grey that would expose their periscopes and conning towers to the aircraft that hunted them. What perhaps distinguishes this night from other convoy battles, what makes it both terrible and almost numbing in its scale, is not the drama of individual moments, but the relentless accumulation of them. There was no single spectacular engagement, no clear victory and defeat played out in a few moments of intense action. Instead, there was an extended period of methodical destruction, of merchant ships being picked off like targets in a practice range, of escort vessels responding with everything they had and finding it insufficient, of the convoy system itself being tested to a degree that revealed both its essential brittleness and its surprising capacity to absorb losses and continue. By dawn, the night would be recognized for what it was, the climactic moment of the entire battle, the point at which the convoy had come closest to complete dissolution, and yet also, as it would turn out, the beginning of the moment when the balance would shift. The night of March 16th wore on, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the horizon, a sound began that would shift everything. It started as a low murmur, something felt rather than heard at first, a tremor in the frequencies that German radio operators had learned to dread. The merchant crews, exhausted beyond measure, some of them now manning lifeboats or huddled in compartments below deck, had no way of knowing that deliverance was approaching at altitude. Above the black Atlantic, moving through cloud banks and the remnants of winter weather, 4-engine bombers were cutting their way eastward across the ocean gap that had, for so long, belonged entirely to the wolves beneath the surface. These were consolidated B-24 Liberators, long-range maritime patrol aircraft that had, only recently, gained the range to reach this far into the mid-Atlantic. For weeks and months, the convoys had transited through what was known as the Black Pit, that terrible stretch of ocean where no shore-based aircraft could reach, where the U-boats hunted with near impunity because the sky above remained empty of protectors. It was the gap in the umbrella, and it was precisely where convoy SC-122 and HX-229 found themselves now, caught at the moment when technology was shifting in almost imperceptible ways. The Liberator patrols, though still rare and precious, were beginning to change the mathematics of war in the Atlantic. On the morning of the 17th, as the convoys struggled eastward and the U-boats continued their grim work, the first long-range patrol aircraft made contact. There is something worth considering about the experience of those pilots and flight crews. They had been searching an ocean so vast and featureless that finding a specific convoy was less science than it was educated hoping, navigating by dead reckoning and radio direction finding, watching for the telltale smoke on the horizon that would announce the presence of merchant shipping. When they found the columns, and here the irony deepens, the sight before them was one of scattered vessels, smoke rising from multiple locations, the neat geometric patterns of a convoy already torn apart by the very predators they had come to confront. Yet their arrival meant something crucial. The moment a U-boat received word that aircraft were in the vicinity, the entire tactical picture changed. Submarines of that era were surface ships that could dive. They needed to operate at the surface or just beneath it to maintain reasonable speeds, to keep pace with a convoy, to hunt. Facing an aircraft equipped with depth charges and radar, a U-boat's advantage evaporated. The only rational choice was to submerge, and when a U-boat submerged, its effective hunting speed dropped dramatically. A diving boat could manage perhaps 3 knots, perhaps a bit more in optimistic conditions, while the convoy was making between 8 and 10 knots forward. In moments, distance would open between predator and prey. What happened across the 17th and 18th of March was a gradual turning of the hunters into the hunted, though not in the way one might imagine. There were no spectacular battles between aircraft and submarines, no dramatic explosions captured by cinematographers. Instead, what occurred was quieter and perhaps more decisive. The liberators, flying patrols from bases in Iceland and Northern Ireland, maintained a presence that grew stronger as more aircraft became available. They did not need to sink U-boats in large numbers to change the equation. They merely needed to be there, to force the German boats to stay submerged, to deny them the surface speed that made coordinated wolfpack attacks possible. The merchant crews noticed the difference almost immediately. The attacks became fewer. The relentless pattern of ships being sunk through the long darkness began to thin. For men standing watch on the remaining vessels, the sound of aircraft engines, strange though it may seem to modern ears, became a sound of hope rather than indifference. These were their own aircraft, their own shield being raised against the water below. On the German side of the equation, Dönitz and his commanders in Paris were receiving increasingly desperate signals from the U-boats in the wolfpacks. What had been a coordinated assault was dissolving into frustration. The boats were being forced deep. Communications were becoming difficult. The convoy was pulling away. There is a certain melancholy to reading those historical records, the German patrol reports growing more pessimistic as the hours passed. The tactical situation that had seemed so promising, two convoys nearly overlapping, a concentration of merchant shipping ripe for slaughter, was slipping away. By the morning of the 18th, a decision had effectively been made, though perhaps not as a single command, so much as a recognition of reality. The U-boats were ordered to break off. The wolf packs that had been coordinating with such lethal effect were dispersed. The black pit, that terrible empty space of ocean, had begun to shrink. Not because any single new technology had been perfected, not because any revolutionary tactic had been discovered, but because the long-range patrol aircraft had reached far enough, been based near enough, and arrived with sufficient frequency that the old rules no longer applied. Consider what this meant for the broader Atlantic campaign. The liberators, though few in number, represented a threshold being crossed. They were the first evidence that the age of the U-boat's dominion in the middle of the ocean was ending. In the months and years to come, this air cover would become more dense, more continuous, more deadly to submarines. Aircraft with better radar, with refined tactics, with greater numbers, would gradually make the mid-Atlantic less and less hospitable to the German submarine fleet. The turning point, when historians mark it, often points to this moment and these next weeks, not to a single battle lost or a decisive sinking, but to the gradual expansion of the protective umbrella that had previously left so much of the ocean exposed. What is often lost in the broader strategic accounts is the quiet relief felt by individual sailors on those merchant vessels. Men who had been expecting to hear the screech and shudder of a torpedo, who had been living with the intimate knowledge that they might be dead within the hour, suddenly found that the danger, while not vanished, had receded to something approaching manageable. The convoys were still losing ships. Loss continued through the 18th and into the 19th, but the pattern had broken. The coordinated wolfpack assault had been degraded into something less organized, less deadly, less inevitable. The aircraft themselves, the liberators, were not designed as elegant war machines. They were workmanlike, functional, sometimes called ungainly by comparison with the sleeker fighters that had captured imaginations. But they had a quality that mattered more than aesthetics: endurance. They could stay aloft for extended periods, could cover vast stretches of ocean, could return to base and go back out again, day after day. They became the thread that would gradually seal the gap. As night fell on the 17th, and the convoys continued their slow passage eastward, the mathematics of survival had shifted in favor of those merchant sailors who had already given so much simply by being present on the Atlantic. They did not know yet that the worst was past. They could not have known that the battle itself, as it would be remembered, was entering its final phase. But perhaps on some level, in the way that exhausted men sometimes sense change in their environment, they felt it. The presence of aircraft overhead meant something ancient and true, that they were no longer alone in a void of water and sky. Someone was watching, someone cared enough to come. When morning came on March 16th and the skies finally began to clear, the escort commanders could at last count what remained. The mathematics of loss, when you gather them all together, tell a story far more complex than any single sinking ever could. 22 merchant vessels had gone down across those 3 terrible nights. Ships carrying grain and steel and oil and explosives. Ships crewed by men who would never see their families again. Ships that represented the labor of thousands of workers in shipyards on both sides of the Atlantic. Each one a small tragedy, multiplied by crew lists ranging from 20 to 80 souls. The Southern Princess was among them, as was the Kingsbury, the Coracero, the Irenia with her precious cargo, the Eadsfall and the Iceland, and so many others whose names have faded now into historical footnotes. Some went down so quickly that lifeboats never launched. Some broke in half and slid beneath the grey water in minutes. Some burned on the surface for hours while men clung to rafts, watching their ships die. The scale of it, when you step back and view it whole rather than moment by moment, carries a weight that even the night-by-night telling cannot fully convey. More than 1,000 merchant sailors lost their lives in those 72 hours. Some drowned, some frozen in lifeboats drifting in the March cold, some picked up by rescue ships, only to succumb to exposure or wounds in the days that followed. Yet something curious happens when we turn our attention to the other side of the accounting. The U-boats, those sleek steel predators that had inflicted such devastation, lost only one vessel confirmed in this entire battle. Only one. The U-384, a Type Vig U-boat under the command of Kapitänleutnant Helmut Furr. She was attacked and rammed by the British minesweeper HMS Sharpshooter after being forced to the surface, damaged by depth charges and struggling with mechanical failures. The ramming tore open her hull beyond repair, and she sank with her crew, taking down Furr and 51 other officers and men. One submarine against 22 merchant ships. The ratio seems almost unbalanced when you consider it in those raw terms. And yet, it was precisely this disparity that haunted Allied commanders, even as they celebrated the convoy's survival. Here emerges a quieter kind of lesson, one that historians have pondered since those days. The German submariners were superbly trained, operating vessels of remarkable engineering for their time. They were aggressive, disciplined, and coordinated in ways that previous naval actions had not fully demonstrated. The loss of U-384, while symbolically important, represented only a fraction of the wolf pack that had attacked. Other boats slipped away damaged, limped back to their pens in France for repair, and would sail again. The U-boat threat, in March of 1943, was far from broken, even if this particular battle had turned against the Germans. But pause here and consider what the numbers truly meant for the people who had to act upon them. An escort commander looking at those tallies would have seen not vindication but failure. His mission, according to the doctrine he had been taught and the orders he had been given, was to protect the convoy. To lose 22 ships meant that convoy protection had failed on a catastrophic scale. Yes, the escort vessels had driven off the U-boats before they could sink the entire convoy. Yes, aircraft had arrived and forced the submarines under. Yes, the convoy had limped onward and eventually reached port with most of its ships intact. But the loss of over 1,000 lives weighed differently in the minds of men tasked with their protection than it might weigh in the cool recitation of historical statistics. The Germans, by contrast, viewed the engagement with something approaching satisfaction, at least initially. Wolfpack tactics had proven themselves capable of overwhelming even a reasonably well-escorted convoy. 22 merchant ships sunk represented substantial tonnage, somewhere in the region of 141,000 tons of shipping, along with all its contents and crew. That was a victory by any measure the German Admiralty understood. The loss of a single U-boat seemed, to them, an acceptable price for such a result. Admiral Dönitz, receiving reports of the engagement from his headquarters in Berlin, could justifiably claim that the Raubgraf, Stürmer, and Dränger Wolfpacks had struck a significant blow against the Allies' ability to sustain their forces. Yet even this assessment harbours a hidden complexity, one that becomes apparent only when we zoom outward and consider the broader trajectory of the Atlantic campaign. The three Wolfpacks involved in the HX-229 and SC-122 engagement had attacked at nearly full strength. They had coordinated superbly across 3 nights of chaos and darkness. They had achieved a remarkable tally of sinkings. And yet, despite all of this, they had not annihilated the convoys as they might have been able to do merely months before. Better escort coordination, superior intelligence about U-boat positions, when that intelligence was available, and the ever-increasing presence of long-range aircraft were beginning to shift the balance, albeit slowly and at great cost. The 22 merchant ships and the 1 U-boat represent, in their asymmetry, the beginning of the end for the German submarine campaign, even though neither the Germans nor the Allies fully grasped it at that moment. The Allies were still losing heavily, still suffering casualties on a tragic scale, still watching their shipping disappear into the depths. The Germans were still launching attacks with confidence, still believing that their submarines could strangle Britain and prevent American supplies from reaching Europe. But the balance, invisible at first, had already begun to tip. Consider how these numbers would have appeared to the different audiences who received news of the engagement. To a family in Liverpool or Baltimore or Glasgow, the loss of 22 ships meant concern, perhaps grief, perhaps simply anxiety for a brother or father who worked the merchant marine and might have been on one of those vessels. The loss of U-384 would have meant nothing to them, would not have registered against the loss of a loved one. To the Board of Admiralty, and the Admiralty's opposite numbers in the American Navy Department, the calculus was different. They saw a battle in which the convoy had largely survived, where merchant ships had been delivered despite heavy casualties, where the escort had performed admirably under overwhelming pressure, where air support had finally arrived and proven decisive. To Dönitz and the German High Command, the numbers told a story of continued German dominance in the Atlantic, even as subtle indicators that this dominance was waning began to accumulate in their intelligence reports. Within weeks, they would find themselves facing even greater challenges, would discover that their codes were being broken far more extensively than they had realized, and would ultimately be forced to withdraw their U-boats from the convoy routes. But in March of 1943, standing on the precipice between an era of German naval success and an era of German failure, neither side could yet fully see which direction the battle was turning. What we might reflect upon, as we consider these quieter aspects of the tally, is how numbers themselves can deceive. 22 and 1 are objective facts, yet their meaning shifts depending on perspective, context, and the longer patterns they fit into. The merchant sailors who lost their lives and the U-boat crew who went down with U-384 knew nothing of such historical perspectives. They knew only the immediate terror of their final moments, the cold water, the darkness, the reality of death arriving suddenly in the vastness of the Atlantic. For them, no calculus of strategic value or historical significance offered consolation. In the days and weeks that followed the engagement, various officials and commanders would analyze what had happened and what it signified. The British convoy system would continue to evolve. Escort tactics would be refined further. New weapons, new technologies, new procedures would be implemented. The merchant marine would continue to suffer losses, continue to carry cargo across hostile waters, continue to feed the machinery of war on both sides of the Atlantic. One U-boat lost and 22 merchant ships sunk became, in the vast accounting of the Second World War, one engagement among thousands, one statistic among millions. And yet it mattered, in ways both visible and subtle, to the course of the war itself. In the grey dawn that followed those March nights, the surface of the Atlantic lay scattered with debris and the small, floating remnants of a great struggle. Oil slicks stretched across miles, catching what little light the overcast sky allowed, and among them drifted empty lifeboats, wooden hatches, and the personal effects of men who would never retrieve them. The rescue operations that began in the immediate aftermath were themselves a kind of ordeal, separate from, but no less exhausting than the battle itself. Escort vessels that had fought through the night to protect their charges now turned to the grim work of searching the dark water for survivors, knowing that the sea had already claimed far more than it would yield back. Those men who had been pulled from the water, whose lifeboats had been spotted by alert lookouts, faced a peculiar kind of shock. The adrenaline of the sinking itself had sustained them through those first terrifying minutes, but as they were hauled aboard, wrapping themselves in whatever blankets and dry clothing could be spared from vessels already stretched thin, they entered a state of profound disorientation. Some could not speak for hours. Others could not stop speaking, their minds replaying the moment the torpedo struck, the lurch of the ship, the screaming of steel, and the silence that followed. The medical orderlies aboard the escorts, many of them young men themselves with limited training, did what they could with severe burns, hypothermia, broken bones, and wounds that would never fully heal. The destroyers and corvettes that had raced to rescue stations found that time was always the enemy. How many men could be pulled from the water in the minutes before darkness fell? How many lifeboats could be located before they drifted beyond sight? The mathematics of rescue, unlike the mathematics of war, offered no satisfaction, only the terrible arithmetic of lives saved against lives lost. The merchant crews who had survived the journey across the Atlantic found themselves changed in ways both obvious and subtle. Some would never return to the sea. Others could not imagine doing anything else. There was a particular kind of courage required to climb back aboard a ship, knowing what you had seen, knowing what could happen. The shipping companies understood this, and while the war continued, they had no choice but to ask men to undertake the crossing again. The convoys must continue. The cargo must reach Britain. Yet those who had lived through the sinking of their vessels carried something with them that no amount of official commendation could quite acknowledge or repair. They had been tested in a way that civilians in the protected ports of New York and Halifax could scarcely comprehend. What emerged from the aftermath of the battle was not an immediate revolutionary change in strategy, but rather a slow, determined recognition that the system required fundamental restructuring. The British naval staff and their American counterparts, working together through the growing alliance, began to understand with new clarity what the merchant sailors had understood for months. The convoy system as it existed was not yet sufficient. The mid-Atlantic gap, that vast stretch of ocean where no aircraft could reach, remained the U-boat's hunting ground, and it remained nearly impossible to defend. The losses tallied from HX-229 and SC-122 made this unbearable fact undeniable. 22 ships, thousands of tons of cargo, some irreplaceable. Food supplies for a hungry nation, ammunition for armies, and the loss of merchant sailors whose names, for the most part, were recorded in ledgers and shipping office records, not in the headlines that celebrated naval victories. The first response was the most straightforward and, in some ways, the most important. Convoy routing was refined with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Where was the U-boat concentration thickest? Where had the losses been greatest? Could routes be altered, even at the cost of longer passages and greater fuel consumption, to skirt around known Wolfpack positions? This intelligence work, relying on the continued efforts of the codebreakers at Bletchley Park and the radio direction finding operators on both sides of the Atlantic, became the lifeline of survival. When the intelligence was good, when the convoys could be routed around danger, the losses dropped. When the intelligence failed, as it had in March, the cost was measured in sinking ships and drowned men. The very fact that HX-229 and SC-122 had been routed into the path of the assembled Wolfpacks suggested to some analysts that the routing decisions themselves required more human wisdom, more caution, and perhaps a broader acceptance of slower, less efficient routes that might trade time for safety. But routing alone could never solve the fundamental problem. Wolfpacks were growing in number and sophistication. The U-boat force would expand throughout the spring of 1943, and Dönitz remained convinced that the Atlantic could still be conquered if only his submarines had sufficient time and numbers. The real solution, everyone understood, lay in closing the air gap. What was needed was a way to project aircraft power into the mid-Atlantic, over routes where no land-based aircraft could reach. The technology already existed, or nearly so. Escort carriers, small flat-top vessels that could be armed with a handful of aircraft, had been proposed and were in various stages of construction or conversion. These ships would sail with the convoys themselves, carrying fighters and sometimes bombers, able to launch at the first sign of danger. The loss of the Southern Princess and the other merchantmen of HX-229 and SC-122 became, in the hands of those making strategic decisions, an argument for accelerating these projects, for accepting the industrial cost and the risk of committing precious ships and aircraft to a new kind of naval warfare. The months following March 1943 saw a gradual but inexorable shift in the balance of power on the Atlantic. New U-boats were still being built and dispatched to the hunting grounds, but they arrived to find conditions changing. By May, the first escort carrier moved into position with a convoy. By June, more were at sea. The aircraft themselves, long-range liberators flying from Iceland and the Azores as bases became available, extended the air umbrella further into the mid-Atlantic with each passing week. The U-boats, which had enjoyed a period of near invulnerability in certain stretches of the ocean, found their world shrinking. To be sighted meant to be attacked. To be attacked meant to dive, to lose the convoy's position, to fall back and try again from a different angle. The ease and confidence that had characterized the Wolfpack operations in March began to erode. There was a cost to this transformation, though not in the form of a single catastrophic battle. Rather, the cost was distributed across months, across the cumulative loss of U-boats that could no longer operate safely on the surface, that were damaged by aircraft and forced to break contact, that were sunk by coordinated attacks from destroyer and aircraft working together. By August, Dönitz would make the decision that the Atlantic was no longer profitable, that the losses now exceeded the shipping tonnage being sunk, and that the U-boats should be withdrawn to other waters or kept in harbour for training. This decision was not made lightly, and it was not made in a single moment. But the seeds of it were planted in March, in the waters where HX-229 and SC-122 had struggled to survive, in the lifeboats where men floated waiting for rescue, in the calculations made by strategists who understood that the battle of attrition was slowly turning. The aftermath, then, was not merely the rescue and recovery operations, though those mattered profoundly to the men pulled from the sea. It was a recalibration of strategy, a recognition that the convoy system required not just better routing and code breaking, but a fundamental change in the nature of naval protection. The lesson of those March nights was written in the manifest of lost ships and in the lives of merchant sailors who had risked everything for the sake of delivering goods across a hostile ocean. And as the war continued, as new tactics emerged and new technologies were deployed, that lesson remained central. The convoy would endure, but only because those who governed its fate had understood, finally and fully, what was required to make it work. What the captains and commanders did not yet know, as they counted their losses in those first weeks of April, was that they had just witnessed the last great crescendo of the U-boat war in the Atlantic. The convoys HX-229 and SC-122, having endured their crucible in the darkness, had unknowingly marked a threshold, a moment after which the German submarine fleet would never again achieve such concentrated, devastating success against the merchant marine. The mathematics of the Atlantic were shifting, though imperceptibly at first. Yes, the wolf packs had sunk 22 ships and claimed enormous tonnage. Yes, they had proven once more that the mid-Atlantic gap, that vast stretch of ocean beyond the reach of land-based air cover, remained a realm where they could hunt with relative impunity. But something subtle had begun to change, something that would only become apparent in hindsight, like watching the tide turn from the shore. So gradual, so quiet, that you might miss it if you were not paying attention. Allied codebreakers, their nerves still raw from the recent intelligence blackout, had accelerated their efforts to re-establish continuous reading of U-boat communications. The temporary loss of the Enigma, decrypts that had allowed German submarines to slip past convoy routes in March, was being systematically overcome. Within weeks, not months, Bletchley Park would once again be reading the daily disposition of German submarines with remarkable clarity. And once that window reopened, the Allies would route their convoys not around the wolf packs, but away from them entirely. The hunters would find themselves perpetually searching empty ocean, while the prey slipped past in the darkness, unseen and untraced. The aircrafts, too, were multiplying. Long-range liberators were being produced in ever greater numbers. Escort carriers, those small converted merchant ships that could deliver fighter cover to the mid-Atlantic itself, were entering service month by month. The very air gap that had been the U-boat's refuge was contracting, drawing inward like a wound closing. Within only a few more months, there would be virtually no stretch of the Atlantic, from American shores to the British Isles, that could not be reached by some form of Allied air support. And the U-boat, which had ruled the surface and the depths through the early years of the war, would become vulnerable in ways it had never been before. Perhaps most crucially, the lessons of HX-229 and SC-122 had been learned and absorbed across the entire Allied convoy system. The escorts had fought with courage and improvisation, but their numbers had been insufficient. No amount of bravery could compensate for a 3-to-1 deficit in surface combat capability. The Admiralty and the American Navy had seen the proof written in sinking ships and men in lifeboats, and the response was swift and deliberate. More escorts would be built. Destroyer escort groups, formalized and equipped with new detection technology, would soon become the norm. The corvettes and older frigates that had done so much with so little would be reinforced by faster, more capable warships. The convoys themselves would never again be quite so vulnerable, nor quite so inadequately protected. The shock of the March convoy battles, particularly HX-229 and SC-122, reverberated through the decision-making chambers of the Allied High Command like a bell that could not be unrung. And from that shock came action. In the wider context of the Atlantic campaign, these two convoys represented the final moment of genuine doubt, the last time when it seemed possible, even probable, that the U-boats might yet turn the tide of the war through strangling Britain's supply lines. After March 1943, the curve would begin its inexorable turn. The U-boats would continue to fight, to sink ships, to take losses and inflict them. But the strategic moment when Germany might have driven Britain to the negotiating table through the destruction of her merchant marine, that moment was passing, like a ship slipping over the horizon. Dönitz himself would sense this shift within months. The losses were mounting, while successes grew rarer. The technology of anti-submarine warfare was advancing faster than German engineers could counter it. The element of surprise, that crucial advantage the U-boats had held for so long, was being systematically stripped away by radio direction finding equipment, by radar, by aircraft that appeared with startling regularity in the sky above. By May of 1943, less than 2 months after HX-229 and SC-122 had fought their desperate passage across the Atlantic, Dönitz would order many of his U-boats withdrawn from the North Atlantic entirely. The Wolfpack tactics would continue in other theatres, but the campaign to starve Britain into submission was, in practical terms, already over. The merchantmen who had sailed with HX-229 and SC-122 did not know this, of course. For the survivors, there would be more convoys to sail, more journeys across dangerous waters, more nights of listening to the sea and wondering if this would be the one when the torpedoes came. Some among them would face those torpedoes again before the war ended. Some would live to see the victory they had fought so quietly, so persistently to achieve. Others had already made their final crossing, resting now in waters so cold and deep that no rescue ship could ever reach them. But looking back from our vantage point, knowing what would unfold over the months and years that followed, it becomes clear that those ships, those sailors, those brave and exhausted men in uniform and in merchant service, had collectively crossed a threshold in March 1943. They had endured what would prove to be the last great test of their supply lines. The tide that had flowed so strongly against the Allies for so long was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to turn, and the turning would only accelerate from there. The North Atlantic, as we know it now, holds no memory of March 1943. The cold that bit at the faces of merchant sailors and naval officers alike has long since dissolved into the vast indifference of deep water. The waves that lifted and rolled beneath those steel hulls, the Empire Falkland, the Meridian, the Iona, they have turned over countless billions of times since. Each molecule of salt spray from that battle scattered now into the gentle breath of modern seas, unknowable and unremarkable. Consider the ocean in its present stillness. There are freighters crossing those same waters today, but they move in different ways, guided by satellites and electronic charts, their holds filled with containerized cargo instead of loose cases of ammunition and drums of oil. The routing is deliberate, calculated by algorithms rather than the hand-drawn pencil marks of convoy officers studying weather maps and U-boat disposition reports. And yet, beneath the surface, the water itself remains nearly unchanged. The same pressure, the same darkness at 500 feet, the same cold that would claim a human body in minutes. The men who lived through those convoy battles are themselves now part of history's tide. The merchant mariners who signed aboard in New York or Halifax, who knew they might not reach Liverpool, who wrapped their few possessions in canvas and climbed the gangway despite that knowledge. Most are gone now. Some died in the war itself, whether by torpedo or depth charge or the simple hypothermia of the Atlantic. Others survived and lived long lives ashore, speaking little of those crossings, perhaps taking their memories to graves in small towns across Canada and Britain and America. A few, if any, remain, are very old now, and their accounts have been recorded, preserved, and now rest quietly in archives and maritime museums. What would they see if they could return to those waters today? Perhaps they would search for some residual impression of their ordeal, some ghostly mark left by the violence that unfolded there. But the ocean erases. It does not preserve like land does, with monuments and plaques and careful historical societies to keep the past visible. The ships that went down, the Southern Princess, the Elterman, the Harpsichord, and so many others, they rest on the bottom now, slowly being consumed by salt and sediment and the patient organisms of the deep. Their holds are empty of cargo that once seemed so vital. The torpedo damage that tore through their hulls has been worn smooth by time and current. The U-boats themselves, those sleek predators that caused such devastation, are equally gone. The wolf packs that converged on HX-229 and SC-122, Raubgraf, Stürmer, Dränger, they hunted, they damaged, they lost at least one of their own in the struggle. The U-boat crews, many of them teenagers, men in their early 20s who had trained in the Baltic and learned the art of silent running and the cold precision of torpedo attack, they too have passed. Some were killed in action, some survived the war and lived under the weight of what they had done. Some built families and grew old. Their descendants walk the streets of Germany today, perhaps unaware that their grandfathers once sat in a steel tube beneath the Atlantic, hunting merchant sailors through the dark. The battle itself has become data, become stories, become numbers in a historical ledger. 22 ships lost, 13,000 tons of cargo sunk, hundreds of men dead or missing, one U-boat destroyed. These figures are remarkably compact when you consider the scale of human suffering they represent. The nights spent in lifeboats, the oil-slicked faces of survivors being pulled from the water, the last moments of those who sank. And yet, compressed into statistics, the battle sits now in a particular place in the historical record. The last great convoy battle, the turning point after which the tide shifted, slowly but inexorably, against the U-boat arm. What did it mean, that battle? Perhaps it meant that the strategy of commerce raiding could not prevail against a determined convoy system, even a fragile one. Perhaps it demonstrated that merchant sailors, ordinary men drafted by circumstance and duty into extraordinary danger, possessed a kind of courage that no weapon could quite overcome. Perhaps it showed that even in the depths of war, when nations poured millions of tons of steel and blood into the Atlantic, the basic geometry of ocean warfare, the hunter and the hunted, the vastness of the sea, the vulnerability of slow ships carrying precious cargo, these remained constant, unchanging through all the technical innovations and tactical brilliance that generals and admirals could devise. In the decades that followed, the battle faded from public consciousness. It was superseded by larger events, by the final campaigns of the war in Europe and the Pacific, by the emergence of new threats and new weapons in the atomic age. The Navy's records were filed. The memorial services were held and then ceased to be held. Ships are built now with no memory of those lost. Young sailors join navies around the world without studying the specific details of HX-229 and SC-122, though perhaps they learn something of the broader Battle of the Atlantic in their training. And so the ocean returns to itself, to its own profound indifference. The water that was cold and hostile in 1943 is still cold and hostile to the human body, but it is no longer a battleground. It is simply water, endlessly cycling, endlessly moving, endlessly profound in its ancient patience. The ships and the men are gone. The fear is gone. The urgency is gone. What remains is only the record, and the slow settling of these events into the deep archive of the past, the way old things settle when they come to rest in the darkness below the light. There is a quietness that comes when a story ends, when the final chapter closes, not an ending of sound, necessarily, but an ending of tension, of forward motion, of the urgent pull toward knowing what happens next. The outcome is known, the voyage is complete. And now, as these waters of March 1943 fade deeper and deeper into the distance of time, as the men who sailed them become names in ledgers and entries in databases, there is a gentle exhale,